In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula, in a city called Mecca, our story begins in the year 570 CE. This was a time when caravans crossed vast deserts, when trade routes connected distant civilizations, and when the Arabian tribes lived among ancient traditions. Fact 1. Islam began with the birth of Muhammad ibn Abdullah in Mecca in the year 570 CE, in a region that is now modern-day Saudi Arabia. He was born into the Quraysh tribe, one of the most prominent tribes in Mecca, and his early life would be marked by both loss and remarkable character development. Muhammad's father, Abdullah, died before he was born, and his mother, Amina, passed away when he was only 6 years old. This left the young Muhammad an orphan, and he was taken in first by his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, and then by his uncle, Abu Talib. Despite these early hardships, Muhammad grew into a young man known throughout Mecca for his honesty and trustworthiness. Fact 2. Muhammad became known by the nickname Al-Amin, which means the trustworthy one, because of his reputation for honesty and integrity in business dealings and personal conduct, even before he became a prophet. As a young man, Muhammad worked as a merchant and shepherd. He would lead trading caravans across the desert, and it was through this work that he met Khadijah, a wealthy widow and successful businesswoman who was impressed by his character and business acumen. She proposed marriage to him, and despite being 15 years his senior, they formed a loving partnership that would last 25 years. Muhammad was 40 years old when he received his first revelation in the year 610 CE, while he was meditating in a cave called Hira on Mount Jabal al-Nur, just outside of Mecca. Muhammad had developed a habit of retreating to this cave for periods of contemplation and reflection, seeking solitude away from the bustling city below. It was during one of these retreats in the Islamic month of Ramadan that the angel Jibril, known as Gabriel in the Christian tradition, appeared to him. The angel commanded him to read, though Muhammad was unable to read or write. Fact 4. The first word revealed in the Quran was Iqra, which means read or recite. And these first verses emphasize the importance of knowledge, learning, and recognizing God as the creator of humanity. The encounter left Muhammad shaken and confused. He rushed home to Khadijah, trembling, and asked her to cover him with a blanket. Khadijah believed in his experience and became the very first person to accept Islam, offering him comfort and support. She took him to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nawfal, a Christian scholar who had knowledge of previous scriptures. Waraka confirmed that what Muhammad had experienced was divine revelation, similar to what had been given to Moses and other prophets before him. Fact 5. The revelations that Muhammad received over the next 23 years were memorized by his followers and later compiled into the Quran, which Muslims believe is the literal word of God and the final revelation to humanity. For the first 3 years, Muhammad shared his message only privately with close friends and family. Along with Khadijah, early converts included his cousin Ali, his close friend Abu Bakr, and his adopted son Zayd. These early Muslims would meet secretly to pray and recite the revelations together, knowing that the message of monotheism would challenge the polytheistic traditions of Meccan society. Fact 6. The core message of Islam centers on Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God, and the belief that there is no deity worthy of worship except Allah, with Muhammad as his final messenger to all of humanity. The city of Mecca at this time was a center of pilgrimage for the Arabian tribes who came to worship at the Kaaba, a cubic structure that housed numerous idols representing different tribal gods. The economy of Mecca depended heavily on this pilgrimage trade, and the wealthy merchants of the Quraysh tribe had significant power and influence derived from maintaining these religious traditions. Fact 7. Muslims believe that the Kaaba in Mecca was originally built by the Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael as a house of worship dedicated to the one God. though it had been filled with idols over the centuries before Islam. When Muhammad began preaching publicly after 3 years of private teaching, his message of monotheism was seen as a direct threat to Meccan society. The powerful leaders of the Quraysh tribe saw this new religion as dangerous to their economic interests and social order. They began to persecute the early Muslims, particularly those who were poor, enslaved, or lacked tribal protection. Fact 8. The early Muslim community faced severe persecution in Mecca, with some believers being tortured, boycotted, and even killed for abandoning the traditional polytheistic beliefs of their tribes. Among those who suffered greatly was Bilal ibn Rabah, an enslaved African man who was one of the early converts to Islam. His master would take him out into the desert heat and place heavy stones on his chest, trying to force him to renounce his faith. But Bilal would only say, Ahad, Ahad, meaning one, one, referring to the oneness of God. He was eventually freed by Abu Bakr, who purchased and liberated him. Bilal would later become the first person to give the Islamic call to prayer, the Adhan, his beautiful voice echoing across Medina in the years to come. As the persecution intensified, Muhammad sought ways to protect his small but growing community. The situation in Mecca had become increasingly dangerous, and he knew that his followers needed sanctuary, somewhere they could practice their faith without fear of torture or death. Fact 9. In the year 615 CE, Muhammad instructed a group of his followers to migrate to Abyssinia, a Christian kingdom in East Africa ruled by a just king known as the Negus, making this the first migration in Islamic history. Around 80 Muslims made this difficult journey across the Red Sea, seeking refuge in a land where they hoped to find protection. Among them were some of Muhammad's own family members, including his daughter Ruqayya and her husband Uthman. When the Quraysh leaders learned of this migration, they sent emissaries to Abyssinia with gifts for the Negus, asking him to return the Muslims to Mecca. But the Negus, known for his wisdom and justice, called the Muslims before him and asked them to explain their faith. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin, spoke eloquently before the king. He described how they had lived in ignorance and immorality before Islam, how the Prophet had taught them to worship one God, to speak the truth, to honor their commitments, to be kind to neighbors, and to protect the orphan and the widow. He then recited verses from the Quran about Mary and Jesus, which moved the Negus to tears. The Christian king granted the Muslims protection, telling the Quraysh emissaries that this religion and Christianity came from the same divine source. Fact 10. The year 619 CE is known as the Year of Sorrow in Islamic history, as Muhammad lost both his beloved wife Khadija and his protective uncle Abu Talib within a short period of time. Khadija had been Muhammad's greatest supporter, the first to believe in him, the one who had comforted him during his moments of doubt and strengthened him during times of hardship. For 25 years she had been his only wife, his confidant, and the mother of his children. Her death left Muhammad grief-stricken. Abu Talib, though he never accepted Islam himself, had provided Muhammad with crucial tribal protection. Without him, the persecution became even more severe, and Muhammad himself was no longer safe in his own city. In this darkest period, Muhammad sought to spread his message beyond Mecca. He traveled to the nearby city of Ta'if, hoping its people might be more receptive. But instead of welcome, he found hostility. The leaders of Ta'if mocked him and incited street children to chase him out of the city, throwing stones at him until his feet bled. Muhammad left Ta'if wounded and discouraged, taking shelter in an orchard where he prayed to God, not asking for relief from his suffering, but only that God not be displeased with him. Fact 11. According to Islamic tradition, the night journey and ascension, known as Al-Isra wal-Miraj, occurred around this time, when Muhammad was miraculously transported from Mecca to Jerusalem and then ascended through the heavens in a single night. During this miraculous journey, Muhammad is said to have traveled on a winged creature called Al-Buraq to the site in Jerusalem where the Al-Aqsa Mosque would later be built. From there, he ascended through the 7 heavens, meeting previous prophets including Adam, Jesus, Moses, and Abraham. He was brought into the divine presence, and it was during this journey that the 5 daily prayers were prescribed for Muslims. When Muhammad told the Meccans about this experience, many mocked him, but those who believed in him accepted his account as truth. This event strengthened Muhammad's resolve and confirmed his prophetic mission during one of the most difficult periods of his life. Meanwhile, a glimmer of hope was emerging from an unexpected place. During the annual pilgrimage season, when tribes from across Arabia would come to Mecca, Muhammad had been approaching different tribal groups, asking if they would grant him protection so he could preach his message freely. Most rejected him, but a group of men from Yathrib, a city about 250 miles north of Mecca, listened with interest. Yathrib, which would later be renamed Medina, was a city torn by internal conflict between its Arab tribes and Jewish tribes, and some of its people saw in Muhammad's message and leadership a potential solution to their divisions. These men from Yathrib had heard of prophets and scriptures from the Jewish tribes who lived among them. When they heard Muhammad reciting the Quran and explaining his message of monotheism, justice, and social reform, they recognized something familiar yet new. Over the next 2 years, more people from Yathrib secretly traveled to Mecca during the pilgrimage season to meet with Muhammad and pledge their allegiance to him and his message. Fact 13. In 622 CE, Muhammad and his followers undertook the Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Medina, which marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar and represents the establishment of the first Muslim community. This migration was not a simple journey. The Quraysh leaders had learned of the plans and were determined to stop Muhammad. They devised a plot to assassinate him, selecting one young man from each tribe to strike simultaneously so that the guilt would be shared among all the tribes, making it impossible for Muhammad's clan to seek revenge against any single group. But on the night chosen for the assassination, Muhammad asked his cousin Ali to sleep in his bed as a decoy, while he and Abu Bakr slipped out of the city under cover of darkness. The 2 men hid in a cave called Thawr, just outside Mecca, while search parties scoured the area. According to tradition, a spider wove its web across the entrance to the cave, and a dove made its nest there, leading the searchers to believe no one could have recently entered. After 3 days in hiding, Muhammad and Abu Bakr continued their journey north, taking an indirect route through the desert to avoid capture. Fact 14. When Muhammad arrived in Medina, he established the Constitution of Medina, one of the earliest written constitutions in history, which outlined the rights and duties of Muslims, Jews, and pagans living in the city, and established principles of cooperation and religious freedom. This document was revolutionary for its time. It recognized the different religious communities in Medina while uniting them under common principles of mutual defense and justice. It established that disputes would be brought to Muhammad for arbitration, that no one would be wronged or exploited, and that all parties would cooperate in defending the city against external threats. The Jewish tribes were recognized as a community with their own religion, and they were guaranteed protection and freedom of worship. Muhammad set about building not just a religious community, but a functioning society. One of his first acts was to build a simple mosque, which also served as a community center, a place for teaching, and even temporary shelter for those who had migrated from Mecca with nothing but their faith. Muhammad established a system of brotherhood between the Muhajirun, the Muslims who had migrated from Mecca, and the Ansar, the Muslims of Medina who hosted them, pairing each migrant with a local family to ensure everyone had support and resources. This pairing went beyond simple hospitality. The Ansar shared their homes, their wealth, and their livelihoods with the Muhajirun, who had left everything behind in Mecca. Some even offered to divide their property and businesses equally with their new brothers in faith. This remarkable act of generosity and the grateful humility of those who received it created bonds that would hold the community together through the trials ahead. The Ansar would forever be honored in Islamic tradition for their selflessness and their welcome of the Prophet and his message. Fact 16. The Quran introduced revolutionary social reforms for 7th century Arabia, including regulations on marriage and divorce, inheritance rights for women, the prohibition of female infanticide, and the emphasis on caring for orphans and the poor. In the society of pre-Islamic Arabia, women had few rights. Daughters could be buried alive at birth, considered a source of shame. Women could not inherit property, and they had little say in their own marriages. The Quran explicitly forbade infanticide and established that daughters, wives, and mothers had specific inheritance rights. It regulated marriage, requiring the consent of the bride, and establishing that the marriage gift belonged to the woman herself, not her family. It commanded kind treatment of wives and placed limits on divorce while ensuring that women could not simply be abandoned without support. These teachings challenged the existing social order and elevated the status of women in ways that were unprecedented in Arabian society. In Medina, the Muslim community began to flourish, but the Quraysh of Mecca had not forgotten them. The Muslims had left behind their property, their businesses, and their wealth, which the Meccans had seized. More than that, the Quraysh saw this growing community as a threat, particularly as it sat along their vital trade route to Syria. Tensions mounted, and it became clear that conflict was inevitable. Fact 17. The Battle of Badr in 624 CE was the first major military encounter between the Muslims and the Quraysh of Mecca, where approximately 300 Muslims faced a Meccan force of nearly 1,000 warriors. The Muslims had set out to intercept a Meccan trade caravan led by Abu Sufyan, one of the most powerful leaders of the Quraysh. When Abu Sufyan learned of the Muslim plans, he sent an urgent message to Mecca requesting military support and managed to divert his caravan away from danger. Despite the caravan's escape, the Meccan army, already mobilized and eager to crush the Muslim community once and for all, continued marching toward Medina. The two forces met at Badr near a series of wells in the desert. The Muslims were vastly outnumbered and poorly equipped compared to the well-armed Meccan force. Muhammad consulted with his companions, and they decided to face the enemy despite the odds. The battle began with individual duels, a tradition in Arabian warfare, and then escalated into full combat. Against all expectations, the Muslims won a decisive victory, killing many of the Quraysh leaders and taking prisoners. The Muslim victory at Badr was seen by believers as a sign of divine support and transformed the political landscape of Arabia, establishing the Muslims as a force that could not be easily dismissed. The victory boosted Muslim morale tremendously, but it also intensified Meccan determination for revenge. In Medina, Muhammad continued to build the foundations of Islamic society. He emphasized the importance of community prayer, charity, and ethical behavior. The daily prayers that had been prescribed during the night journey became a unifying practice, calling the community together 5 times each day. Fact 19. The 5 daily prayers in Islam, known as Salah, occur at specific times throughout the day. Fajr before sunrise, Duhur at midday, Asr in the afternoon, Maghrib just after sunset, and Isha at night, creating a rhythm of remembrance and worship throughout the day. These prayers served not only as acts of worship, but as moments of pause and reflection in the midst of daily life. They reminded believers of their purpose, brought the community together, and established equality among Muslims, as rich and poor, master and servant, Arab and non-Arab would stand shoulder to shoulder in the same rows. The call to prayer given by Bilal with his powerful voice echoed through Medina, marking the passage of time and inviting everyone to turn their attention toward God. The Quraysh, humiliated by their defeat at Badr, spent the next year preparing for a massive retaliation. Abu Sufyan assembled an army of 3,000 men, including cavalry and archers, and marched on Medina. This force was 10 times larger than what the Muslims could muster. Fact 20. The Battle of Uhud in 625 CE tested the young Muslim community when a tactical error led to a defeat that cost the lives of 70 Muslims, including Muhammad's uncle Hamza, one of the bravest warriors and earliest converts to Islam. Muhammad had initially planned to defend Medina from within the city, but many of his companions, particularly the younger men eager to prove themselves, urged him to meet the enemy in open battle. They marched to Mount Uhud just outside the city, and Muhammad positioned archers on a hill with strict orders not to leave their posts under any circumstances. The battle began well for the Muslims, and the Meccan forces started to retreat. Seeing the enemy flee, most of the archers abandoned their position to collect the spoils of war, despite their orders. Khalid ibn al-Walid, a brilliant Meccan cavalry commander who had not yet embraced Islam, saw the opportunity and led his horsemen around the mountain to attack the Muslims from behind. The Muslim ranks broke in confusion. Muhammad himself was injured, struck in the face by a stone, and rumors spread that he had been killed. The Muslims retreated up the mountain, and the Meccans, satisfied that they had avenged their defeat at Badr, withdrew without pressing their advantage to completely destroy the Muslim force. The loss at Uhud was devastating, not just in lives lost, but in morale. Yet Muhammad used this difficult moment to teach his community about patience, perseverance, and learning from mistakes. The Quran addressed the defeat, reminding the believers that they had contributed to it through their disobedience and that setbacks were tests of faith. In 627 CE, the Muslims faced their greatest threat when a coalition of Meccan and allied forces numbering 10,000 warriors laid siege to Medina in what became known as the Battle of the Trench. The situation seemed hopeless. The entire might of the Quraysh and their allies had united to eliminate the Muslim community once and for all. But a Persian companion named Salman al-Farisi suggested a defensive strategy unknown to the Arabs at that time, digging a trench around the vulnerable parts of the city. This was a Persian military tactic, and though the Arabs found the idea strange, they accepted it. For 6 days, the entire community worked to dig this massive trench, with Muhammad himself participating in the hard labor alongside everyone else. When the coalition army arrived, they found themselves unable to cross the trench with their cavalry. The siege lasted for nearly a month, and both sides endured harsh conditions, particularly the bitter cold winds of winter. The coalition forces, unable to breach the trench and with their supplies dwindling, began to lose cohesion. Disagreements arose among the different tribes in the alliance. Fact 22. The siege ended when a fierce windstorm struck the coalition camp at night, tearing down tents and scattering equipment, which the Muslims interpreted as divine intervention. And the demoralized coalition forces retreated without ever breaching Medina's defenses. After the Battle of the Trench, the balance of power in Arabia began to shift decisively. The Quraysh had thrown everything they had at the Muslims and failed. Muhammad's leadership had proven effective, and more tribes across Arabia began to consider alliances with Medina rather than Mecca. The Muslim community, having survived 3 major conflicts, grew stronger and more confident. Muhammad turned his attention to establishing peace and security for his community. He negotiated treaties with various tribes, established trade relationships, and sent emissaries to neighboring regions. His reputation as a just leader and skilled diplomat spread across the peninsula. Fact 23. In 628 CE, Muhammad and about 1,400 Muslims attempted to perform pilgrimage to Mecca, deliberately traveling unarmed to show their peaceful intentions, which led to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, initially seen as unfavorable but later recognized as a strategic victory. The Quraysh sent negotiators to meet the Muslims before they could enter Mecca, refusing to allow them to complete the pilgrimage that year. After tense negotiations, a treaty was agreed upon. Its terms seemed to favor the Meccans. The Muslims would return to Medina without performing pilgrimage this year, but could return the following year. There would be a 10-year truce, and any Meccan who joined the Muslims without their guardian's permission would be returned, but Muslims who returned to Mecca would not be sent back to Medina. Many of Muhammad's companions were upset by these terms, feeling they had conceded too much. But Muhammad understood the deeper significance of what had been achieved. The treaty recognized the Muslims as a legitimate political entity with whom the Quraysh would negotiate as equals. The 10-year peace would allow Islam to spread through persuasion rather than conflict, and tribes who had been waiting to see the outcome of the Meccan-Muslim rivalry would now feel free to embrace Islam. During the 2 years following the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, more people converted to Islam than in all the previous years combined, as the peace allowed the message to spread through dialogue and example rather than being overshadowed by conflict. The treaty proved to be exactly what Muhammad had foreseen, a clear victory, though it had initially appeared to be a compromise. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the brilliant cavalry commander who had turned the tide at Uhud against the Muslims, embraced Islam during this period, as did Amr ibn al-As, another talented Meccan leader. These conversions brought exceptional military and diplomatic talent to the Muslim community. Tribes throughout Arabia sent delegations to Medina to learn about Islam, and many entered into alliances with the Muslim community or embraced the faith entirely. The peace established by the Treaty of Hudaybiyah transformed the Arabian Peninsula. For the first time in years, people could travel safely, trade could flourish, and ideas could spread without the constant threat of warfare. Muhammad used this time wisely, sending letters to the rulers of neighboring empires, inviting them to embrace Islam. Fact 25. Muhammad sent emissaries carrying letters to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius, the Sasanian Emperor of Persia, the Negus of Abyssinia, the Coptic ruler of Egypt, and other regional leaders, inviting them to accept Islam and establishing diplomatic relations. These letters were remarkable for their time. They addressed some of the most powerful rulers in the known world as equals, inviting them to submit to the one God, rather than demanding tribute or making threats. The letters were courteous but direct, calling these rulers to accountability before God regardless of their earthly power. Some of these rulers received the letters with respect and curiosity, while others rejected them with disdain. The Negus of Abyssinia, who had protected the early Muslims, is said to have accepted Islam. The Byzantine Emperor Heraclius reportedly considered the message seriously, but ultimately declined. The Sasanian Emperor of Persia, however, tore the letter in anger, and according to tradition, Muhammad prayed that his kingdom would be torn apart as he had torn the letter. In Mecca, however, tensions were rising once again. A tribe allied with the Quraysh attacked a tribe allied with the Muslims, violating the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. The Quraysh had supported this attack, breaking the terms of the peace agreement. Muhammad saw this as the release he needed from the restrictive terms of the treaty. He began quietly preparing an army, keeping the destination secret even from most of his companions. In January of 630 CE, Muhammad led an army of 10,000 Muslims toward Mecca, in what would become a nearly bloodless conquest of the city that had persecuted and expelled them 8 years earlier. The army was so large and so well organized that it stunned everyone who saw it. As they approached Mecca, Abu Sufyan, the leader of the Quraysh who had fought against the Muslims for years, rode out to assess the situation. When he saw the size of the Muslim force and realized resistance would be futile, he met with Muhammad. In that meeting, Abu Sufyan accepted Islam, and Muhammad promised safety to anyone who remained in their homes, took refuge in Abu Sufyan's house, or gathered at the Kaaba. The Muslim army entered Mecca from multiple directions, encountering only minor resistance in 1/4 of the city. The conquest was remarkably peaceful, especially considering the years of warfare and persecution that had preceded it. The Meccans who had tortured the early Muslims, who had driven them from their homes, who had fought them in multiple battles, now stood waiting to see what Muhammad would do with his victory. Fact 27. Upon entering Mecca, Muhammad declared a general amnesty, famously asking the Meccans, "What do you think I will do with you?" And when they replied, hoping for mercy, he said, "Go, for you are free," forgiving even those who had persecuted him and his followers most severely. This act of forgiveness left a profound impact on the Meccans. Muhammad could have taken revenge, could have punished those who had wronged him, but instead, he chose mercy. He recognized that forced conversion would be meaningless, and that lasting peace required reconciliation rather than retribution. Many Meccans embraced Islam that day, moved by this unexpected clemency. Others were given time to consider the faith without pressure or coercion. Muhammad then turned to the Kaaba, the ancient cubic structure at the heart of Mecca. For centuries it had been filled with idols, statues representing the various gods of the Arabian tribes. Muhammad entered the sanctuary, and reciting verses from the Quran about truth coming and falsehood perishing, he began removing the idols one by one, having them destroyed. Fact twins believe that by cleansing the Kaaba of idols, Muhammad was restoring the house of worship to its original purpose as established by Abraham and Ishmael, dedicating it once again solely to the worship of the one God. The Kaaba would become the direction of prayer for Muslims worldwide, the Qibla toward which every Muslim turns 5 times a day in prayer. It would become the destination of the annual pilgrimage, the Hajj, which Muslims are required to perform once in their lifetime if they are physically and financially able. The conquest of Mecca meant that this sacred site was now accessible to all believers, and it became the spiritual center of the Islamic world. After securing Mecca, Muhammad faced immediate challenges from tribes who saw the Muslims' growing power as a threat. A large coalition of tribes gathered at Hunain, planning to attack before the Muslims could consolidate their position. Though the Muslims now numbered 12,000, the battle at Hunain nearly became a disaster. Fact 29. At the Battle of Hunain, the Muslim army was initially routed when the enemy launched a surprise attack from an ambush in a narrow valley, causing many of the newly converted Meccans and others to flee in panic. Muhammad stood firm with a small group of faithful companions, calling out to rally his troops. Gradually, the Muslims regrouped and counterattacked, eventually winning the battle decisively. This victory secured Mecca and the surrounding regions, and the vast spoils of war were distributed, with Muhammad giving generously to the new converts from Mecca to win their hearts and strengthen their commitment to Islam. The Ansar, the Muslims of Medina who had welcomed and supported Muhammad from the beginning, felt hurt that these generous gifts were going to those who had only recently stopped fighting against Islam. When Muhammad learned of their feelings, he gathered them and spoke to them with deep emotion, reminding them of their special place in his heart and in Islamic history. He asked them whether they would prefer material goods or that they should be the ones to take the messenger of God home with them. The Ansar wept and said they preferred the companionship of the Prophet to any worldly wealth. With Arabia increasingly united under Islamic rule, Muhammad turned his attention to organizing and teaching his community. The revelations continued to come, providing guidance on matters of worship, law, social relations, and personal conduct. The Quran was being memorized by hundreds of companions, each verse carefully preserved in the hearts of believers. The Quran is composed of 114 chapters called surahs, varying in length from just 3 verses to 286 verses, revealed over approximately 23 years in response to specific situations and general guidance for all times. The revelations addressed immediate concerns of the community while also providing timeless spiritual and moral teachings. Some verses came in response to questions the companions asked, others during moments of crisis or celebration. The longer chapters generally came during the Medinan period and dealt with legal and social matters, while many of the shorter, more poetic chapters came during the Meccan period and focused on the fundamental beliefs of monotheism, the afterlife, and moral accountability. Muhammad emphasized that the Quran was not just to be recited but to be understood and lived. He spent countless hours teaching his companions the meanings of the verses, demonstrating through his own actions how the Quranic principles should be applied in daily life. His wife Aisha later described him as a walking Quran, embodying in his character and conduct everything the revelation taught. The Hadith, the collected sayings and actions of Prophet Muhammad, form the second source of Islamic teaching after the Quran, providing practical examples of how to implement Quranic principles in everyday life. The companions observed Muhammad carefully, remembering not just what he said, but how he prayed, how he treated his family, how he conducted business, how he judged disputes, how he showed kindness to children and animals, how he bore hardship with patience. They noticed that he would help with household chores, mend his own clothes, milk the goats, and never consider any honest work beneath him. They saw how he smiled often, how he was gentle with the weak and firm with the oppressive, how he visited the sick regardless of their faith, and how he honored his commitments even to those who were his enemies. These observations would be passed down through chains of narration, carefully preserved and later compiled into collections of hadith. Scholars would develop rigorous methods to verify the authenticity of these reports, tracing each narration back through its chain of transmitters to ensure reliability. The most authentic collections, compiled by scholars like Bukhari and Muslim in the centuries after Muhammad's death, would become essential references for understanding how to live according to Islamic teachings. In the year 631 CE, delegations from tribes across Arabia traveled to Medina to pledge allegiance to Muhammad and embrace Islam in what became known as the Year of Delegations, marking the widespread acceptance of Islam throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Tribe after tribe sent their representatives to Medina to learn about Islam, negotiate alliances, and join the growing Muslim community. Muhammad received each delegation with warmth and hospitality, teaching them about the faith, answering their questions, and sending teachers back with them to instruct their people in the Quran and Islamic practice. The religion that had begun with one man praying alone in a cave had now united a region that had been fractured by tribal rivalries for centuries. The transformation was remarkable, achieved not primarily through military conquest, but through the compelling message of the Quran and the exemplary character of the Prophet who delivered it. As the year 632 CE began, Muhammad was now in his early 60s, and the transformation of Arabian society was nearly complete. The feuding tribes that had spent generations locked in cycles of revenge and warfare were now united in faith and purpose. Yet Muhammad sensed that his time in this world was drawing to a close, and he wanted to ensure his community understood the core principles they needed to carry forward. Fact 33. In March of 632 CE, Muhammad led what would be his first and final pilgrimage to Mecca, known as the Farewell Pilgrimage, where he delivered a sermon that summarized the essential teachings of Islam to over 100,000 Muslims gathered at Mount Arafat. The vast plain of Arafat, just outside Mecca, was filled with believers who had traveled from across Arabia to perform the pilgrimage with their prophet. They came on camels and on foot from distant villages and from nearby towns, all dressed in simple white garments that erased distinctions of wealth and status. As Muhammad stood before this massive gathering, he delivered a sermon that would echo through the centuries. He spoke of the sanctity of life and property, declaring that the blood and possessions of every Muslim were sacred to every other Muslim. He emphasized the rights of women, instructing husbands to treat their wives with kindness and respect. He proclaimed the absolute equality of all people regardless of race or lineage, stating that an Arab was not superior to a non-Arab, nor was a white person superior to a black person, except in righteousness and good action. He called for the abandonment of the practices of the pre-Islamic era, including the blood feuds and tribal vendettas that had torn society apart for so long. During the farewell pilgrimage, Muhammad established the rituals of Hajj that Muslims continue to perform today, including circling the Kaaba 7 times, walking between the hills of Safa and Marwa, standing in prayer at Arafat, and commemorating Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son. These rituals connected the Muslims to the ancient legacy of Abraham, whom Islam recognizes as a prophet, and the one who, with his son Ishmael, built the Kaaba as a house of worship for the one God. The pilgrimage was a physical and spiritual journey, stripping away the comforts of ordinary life and bringing believers into a state of humble equality before their Creator. Rich and poor, young and old, from every corner of the Muslim world, they would all perform the same simple acts of devotion, wearing the same simple clothes, calling out the same ancient prayer, "Here I am, O God, here I am." At the end of his sermon, a revelation came to Muhammad, completing the message he had been delivering for 23 years. "This day I have perfected your religion for you, completed my favor upon you, and have chosen for you Islam as your religion." Those who heard these words understood their significance. The religion was complete, and the Prophet's mission was fulfilled. Muhammad returned to Medina, but his health began to decline rapidly. He developed severe headaches and fever, yet he continued to lead the community in prayer as long as he was able. When he became too weak to go to the mosque, he asked Abu Bakr, his closest companion and the first adult man to accept Islam, to lead the prayers in his place. Muhammad passed away on June 8th, 632 CE at the age of 63 in the arms of his beloved wife Aisha, leaving behind a transformed Arabia and a message that would spread across the world. The news of his death sent shockwaves through Medina. Many companions were overcome with grief and disbelief. Umar ibn al-Khattab, one of the strongest and most devoted companions, stood in the mosque declaring that the Prophet could not have died, and that anyone who said so was a liar. But Abu Bakr, though he too was devastated, maintained his composure. He entered the house where Muhammad lay, uncovered his face, kissed his forehead, and wept. Then he went to the mosque and addressed the people with words that brought clarity to the chaos of grief. Abu Bakr reminded them that Muhammad was a mortal man, a messenger of God, but not himself divine. He recited a verse from the Quran, "Muhammad is no more than a messenger, and indeed many messengers have passed away before him. If he dies or is killed, will you then turn back on your heels?" His words helped the community understand that while they had lost their beloved prophet, they had not lost the message he brought or the God he worshipped. Islam would continue, not dependent on any individual, but on the eternal truth of its message. Fact 36. Abu Bakr was chosen as the first caliph or successor, not as a prophet, but as the political and spiritual leader of the Muslim community, establishing a system of leadership that would guide Islam through its next phase. The selection of Abu Bakr was made through consultation among the senior companions. He was chosen for his wisdom, his closeness to the Prophet, his deep knowledge of Islam, and his proven character. Abu Bakr himself was humble about the position, addressing the community and telling them that he was not the best among them, but if he did well, they should support him, and if he erred, they should correct him. He established the principle that Islamic leadership was not about personal power, but about service to the community and adherence to the teachings of the Quran and the example of the Prophet. Abu Bakr's caliphate faced immediate challenges. Some tribes, seeing Muhammad's death as the end of their agreements, refused to continue paying the obligatory charity tax, the zakat. Others followed individuals who claimed to be prophets themselves. Abu Bakr remained firm, understanding that allowing people to pick and choose which aspects of Islam to follow would undermine the entire faith. He organized military expeditions to bring these rebellious groups back into the fold, a period known as the Ridda Wars, or Wars of Apostasy. Fact 37. During Abu Bakr's caliphate, the entire Quran into a single written manuscript for the first time, though it had been perfectly preserved in the memories of hundreds of companions who had memorized it during Muhammad's lifetime. Abu Bakr was concerned that as companions who had memorized the Quran began to die, particularly in battles, the oral preservation alone might become vulnerable. He commissioned Zayd ibn Thabit, one of the Prophet's scribes who had been present for many of the revelations, to gather all the written fragments and work with those who had memorized the text to produce a complete, verified manuscript. Zayd approached this task with meticulous care, accepting only verses that could be verified through multiple independent sources and cross-checked with the memorized versions. The compilation was thorough and careful, taking into account fragments written on palm leaves, stones, pieces of leather, and wooden boards, as well as the memories of numerous companions. The resulting manuscript was kept with Abu Bakr, then passed to Umar, who succeeded him, and then to Umar's daughter Hafsa, who had also been one of Muhammad's wives. This master copy would later serve as the basis for the standardized versions distributed throughout the growing Islamic empire. Abu Bakr's caliphate lasted only 2 years, but in that brief time he stabilized the Muslim community, preserved the Quran in written form, and set important precedents for Islamic governance. On his deathbed, he consulted with the senior companions and nominated Umar ibn al-Khattab to succeed him, a choice that was accepted by the community. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who became the second caliph in 634 CE, was known for his justice, administrative genius, and the remarkable expansion of Islamic rule that occurred during his 10-year caliphate, as Muslim armies moved beyond Arabia into the territories of the Byzantine and Persian empires. Umar was a complex figure who had initially been one of Islam's fiercest opponents before his dramatic conversion. He was physically imposing and had a reputation for being strict and uncompromising, yet he was also known for his humility, often personally checking on the welfare of widows and orphans in Medina at night. He lived simply despite being the ruler of an expanding empire, wearing patched clothes and sleeping on a bed of palm fronds. When foreign dignitaries came to meet him, they were often shocked to find the powerful caliph resting under a tree with no guards, accessible to any ordinary person who needed him. Under Umar's leadership, the Muslim armies achieved stunning victories against the 2 great empires of the time. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by years of warfare with Persia, lost control of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt to the rapidly advancing Muslim forces. The Sasanian Persian Empire, which had ruled for centuries, collapsed entirely, with its territories coming under Islamic governance. These conquests were not merely military achievements, but represented a shift in the political and cultural landscape of the entire region. The early Islamic conquests were facilitated not just by military prowess, but by the appeal of Islamic principles of justice and religious tolerance. As many populations in Byzantine and Persian territories had suffered under heavy taxation and religious persecution. The Christian communities in Syria and Egypt, particularly those who followed non-Orthodox denominations, had faced harsh treatment from the Byzantine authorities. The Zoroastrians in Persia, while officially the state religion, coexisted with various minority communities who had limited rights. When the Muslim armies arrived with a message of relatively light taxation, religious freedom for people of the book, Jews and Christians, and competent administration, many of these populations welcomed them, or at least did not resist strongly. The Muslims established a system where non-Muslims could continue practicing their faith in exchange for paying the jizya, a protection tax, which was often lower than the taxes they had previously paid to the Byzantine or Persian authorities. Christians and Jews retained their own religious laws and courts for personal matters, and their places of worship were protected. This approach, while rooted in Islamic principles, was also pragmatic, allowing diverse populations to coexist within the expanding Islamic state. Fact 40. Umar established many administrative innovations that would shape Islamic governance for centuries, including the Diwan system for organizing government departments, regular stipends for soldiers and the needy, and the Islamic lunar calendar with the Hijra as its starting point. The Diwan was a Persian administrative concept that Umar adapted for Islamic governance. He created registers for the army, for financial records, and for the distribution of state revenues. He established a treasury separate from his personal wealth, ensuring that state funds were used for public benefit rather than personal enrichment. He set up a pension system where veterans, widows, and orphans received regular payments from the state. He organized the conquered territories into provinces, each with a governor responsible for administration and justice, and he held these governors accountable, even removing and punishing those who abused their positions. Umar also established the Islamic calendar, which begins not with Muhammad's birth or the first revelation, but with the Hijra, the migration from Mecca to Medina. This choice reflected the Islamic understanding that the true beginning of the Muslim community was not a personal event in Muhammad's life, but the moment when Muslims were able to freely practice and establish their faith. The calendar is lunar rather than solar, with each month beginning with the sighting of the new crescent moon, creating a year of 354 or 355 days that cycles through the seasons over time. Umar's caliphate brought unprecedented growth and transformation to the Islamic world, but it also brought new challenges. As the Muslim community expanded from a tight-knit group centered in Medina to an empire spanning multiple regions and cultures, questions arose about how to maintain the purity of Islamic teachings while adapting to diverse circumstances. Fact 41. Umar was assassinated in 644 CE by a Persian slave named Abu Lu'lu'a, who held a personal grudge, and with his dying breaths, Umar appointed a committee of 6 senior companions to choose his successor, demonstrating the consultative principles that guided early Islamic leadership. The assassination occurred while Umar was leading the dawn prayer in the Mosque of Medina. Abu Lu'lu'a attacked him with a poisoned dagger, stabbing him multiple times before killing himself. As Umar lay dying, he was asked if he would nominate his son to succeed him, but he refused, saying he would not bear the responsibility of leadership both in life and in death. Instead, he named 6 of the most respected companions, all of whom had been promised paradise by the Prophet Muhammad, and instructed them to deliberate and choose the next caliph within 3 days. After careful consultation, the committee selected Uthman ibn Affan, a wealthy merchant who had been among the earliest converts to Islam and had married two of Muhammad's daughters at different times. Uthman was known for his gentleness, generosity, and deep devotion to Islam. He had suffered persecution in Mecca, had migrated to both Abyssinia and Medina, and had used his considerable wealth to support the Muslim community throughout his life. During Uthman's caliphate from 644 to 656 CE, the Islamic Empire continued to expand, and he commissioned the creation of a standardized version of the Quran to be distributed throughout the Muslim territories, ensuring uniformity in the sacred text. As Islam spread across vast distances, regional variations in Quranic recitation began to emerge. Different companions had learned the Quran directly from the Prophet, and while the text was the same, there were minor variations in pronunciation and dialect that reflected the diverse Arabic spoken across the peninsula. Uthman recognized that these variations, though initially harmless, could eventually lead to disputes about the text itself. He commissioned a committee led by Zayd ibn Thabit, the same scribe who had compiled the Quran under Abu Bakr, to produce a standardized text based on the Quraysh dialect, which was the Prophet's own dialect. This committee carefully reviewed the master manuscript that had been preserved with Hafsa, cross-referencing it with the memorized versions of numerous companions. They produced several identical copies that were sent to the major centers of the Islamic world, including Kufa, Basra, Damascus, and Mecca, with instructions that all other written versions should be destroyed to prevent future textual variations. This standardization, far from being a suppression of the Quran, was a careful preservation of the authentic text as it had been revealed to Muhammad. Fact 43. The Quran that Muslims read today is identical to the Uthmanic Codex compiled in the 7th century, with even the order of its chapters and verses remaining unchanged for nearly 1400 years. This remarkable preservation stands as one of the most carefully documented textual traditions in history. From the moment of its revelation, the Quran was being memorized by hundreds of people, with the Prophet himself reviewing the entire text with the angel Gabriel every Ramadan and twice in the final year of his life. The written compilation under Abu Bakr and the standardization under Uthman were done while many of the original memorizers were still alive to verify every word. This dual tradition of memorization and written text has continued unbroken, with millions of Muslims memorizing the entire Quran in its original Arabic to this day, creating a living preservation system that makes any corruption of the text virtually impossible. Despite his piety and service, Uthman's caliphate faced growing challenges. As the Islamic Empire expanded rapidly, new wealth flowed into the Muslim territories, and questions arose about how this wealth should be distributed. Uthman's practice of appointing his relatives from the Umayyad clan to important positions, though based on their competence, created perceptions of nepotism. Regional governors accumulated power, and some began to live luxuriously, which seemed contrary to the simple lifestyle that had characterized the early Muslim leadership. Dissatisfaction grew, particularly in the garrison cities of Kufa and Basra in Iraq and Fustat in Egypt, where soldiers and settlers felt that the wealth generated by their efforts was being mismanaged. Groups of protesters traveled to Medina to present their grievances to Uthman. The situation escalated tragically when a group of rebels besieged Uthman's house. Despite his advanced age and the armed supporters willing to defend him, Uthman ordered that no blood should be shed on his account. He was reading the Quran when the assassins broke in and killed him, his blood staining the pages of the sacred text he held. Fact 44. Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, who had been among the very first to accept Islam as a young boy, became the fourth caliph in 656 CE, but his caliphate was marked by civil wars that would create the first major division in Islamic history. Ali was a figure of tremendous respect within the Muslim community. He had grown up in Muhammad's household, had slept in the Prophet's bed the night of the assassination attempt in Mecca, had married the Prophet's beloved daughter Fatima, and was the father of Muhammad's grandsons, Hassan and Hussein. He was known for his bravery in battle, his eloquence in speech, his depth of knowledge, and his commitment to justice. Yet he inherited a caliphate in crisis, with Uthman's murder leaving the community divided and traumatized. The question of how to respond to Uthman's assassination became the central issue. Some demanded immediate justice for the murdered caliph, while others argued that restoring stability and unity should take precedence. Aisha, the Prophet's widow, along with two senior companions, Talha and Zubair, demanded that the killers be brought to justice immediately. When Ali delayed, arguing that the situation was too chaotic and that he first needed to establish control, these companions raised an army against him. The Battle of the Camel in 656 CE was the first military conflict between Muslims, a tragic confrontation in which Ali's forces fought against an army led by Isha, Talha, and Zubair near Basra, resulting in thousands of deaths and leaving deep scars in the Muslim community. The battle was named for the camel that Aisha rode, which became the focal point of the fighting. Both sides hesitated before engaging, knowing the gravity of Muslims fighting Muslims, but eventually violence erupted. Talha and Zubair were both killed in the battle, and Ali's forces prevailed. When Ali came to Aisha's camel after the fighting, he found her unharmed but surrounded by the bodies of her devoted defenders. Despite their opposition, Ali treated Aisha with utmost respect, addressing her as Mother of the Believers and ensuring she was safely escorted back to Medina with honor. The battle left both sides devastated, not just by the physical losses, but by the spiritual trauma of believers killing believers. Ali wept over the bodies of the fallen, recognizing among them companions who had fought alongside the Prophet. Aisha, too, deeply regretted her involvement, spending the rest of her life refusing to speak about the battle and expressing remorse for her role in the conflict. The wounds from this battle had barely begun to heal when a new, even more serious challenge emerged. Muawiyah, the governor of Syria and a member of the Umayyad clan to which Uthman had belonged, refused to recognize Ali's authority until Uthman's killers were punished. Muawiyah had governed Syria for nearly 20 years and commanded the loyalty of a powerful army. He argued that as Uthman's relative, he had the right and duty to seek justice for his murdered kinsmen. The Battle of Siffin in 657 CE between Ali and Muawiyah's forces lasted for months, with periodic skirmishes, until Muawiyah's men raised Quran manuscripts on their spears and called for arbitration according to the Book of God, leading to a controversial cessation of hostilities. The arbitration that followed became one of the most disputed events in early Islamic history. Ali agreed to the arbitration reluctantly, pressured by some in his own army who felt they could not continue fighting when the Quran itself was being invoked for peace. However, a faction within Ali's army, known as the Khawarij, or those who left, rejected the arbitration entirely. They argued that judgment belonged only to God, and that by agreeing to human arbitration, Ali had committed a grave error. They turned against Ali, considering both him and Muawiyah to have strayed from true Islam. Fact 47. The Khawarij represented the first extremist faction in Islamic history, holding that any Muslim who committed a major sin was no longer a Muslim, and that both Ali and Muawiyah, as well as the arbitrators and anyone who supported them, were apostates whose blood could be lawfully shed. This radical position shocked most Muslims, who understood that faith was not so fragile that a single sin could remove someone from Islam entirely, and that leaders, however imperfect, did not deserve death for political mistakes. Ali tried to reason with the Khawarij, engaging them in theological debates and attempting to demonstrate the flaws in their extreme positions. Some were convinced and returned to his camp, but a hardcore faction remained committed to their view that the Muslim community had become corrupted and needed to be purified through violence. The Khawarij began attacking innocent Muslims, considering anyone who disagreed with them to be a legitimate target. Ali was forced to confront them militarily, defeating them at the Battle of Narawan in 658 CE, but the ideology survived. The Khawarij plotted to assassinate Ali, Muawiyah, and the chief arbitrator simultaneously, believing that removing these leaders would allow the Muslim community to start fresh. Only the assassination attempt on Ali succeeded. Ali ibn Abi Talib was assassinated in 661 CE while leading the dawn prayer in the Mosque of Kufa by a Khawariji assassin named Abd al-Rahman ibn Muljam, marking the end of what Sunni Muslims call the period of the rightly guided caliphs and the beginning of dynastic rule in Islamic history. Ali's death brought an end to the caliphate based on close companionship with the Prophet and consultation among the community's most respected members. His sons, particularly Hassan, had strong claims to leadership, and many of Ali's supporters urged Hassan to fight for his right. But Hassan, seeing the bloodshed that had already torn the Muslim community apart and knowing that more war would only deepen the divisions, made peace with Muawiyah and abdicated his claim to the caliphate in exchange for certain conditions, including that Muawiyah would not designate his own successor, allowing the community to choose the next leader. Muawiyah, however, later broke this agreement and designated his son Yazid as his successor, establishing the Umayyad dynasty and transforming the caliphate from a consultative position into a hereditary monarchy. This change, and the events of Ali's caliphate more broadly, created a lasting division within Islam between those who believed the first four caliphs were all legitimate and rightly guided, and those who believed that Ali should have been the first caliph and that leadership should have remained with Muhammad's family. These two groups would eventually develop into what we know today as Sunni and Shia Islam. The transformation from the simple consultative leadership of the early caliphs to dynastic rule under the Umayyads marked a significant shift in Islamic governance. Yet, despite the political turmoil and the grief over civil conflicts, the religious and intellectual foundations of Islam continued to develop and deepen during this period. Fact 49. The split between Sunni and Shia Islam, which emerged from disputes over leadership after Muhammad's death, represents the largest division within the Muslim community, with Sunnis comprising roughly 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide, and Shias about 10 to 15%. The names themselves reflect different approaches to Islamic authority. Sunni comes from al-Sunnah, meaning people of the tradition, referring to those who follow the Sunnah, the example of the Prophet, and who accepted the legitimacy of the first four caliphs. Shia is short for Shi'at Ali, meaning the party of Ali, referring to those who believed that Ali should have been Muhammad's immediate successor, and that leadership should remain within the Prophet's family through Ali and Fatima's descendants. While both groups share the fundamental beliefs of Islam, the oneness of God, the prophethood of Muhammad, the Quran as divine revelation, and the core practices of prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage, they differ in certain theological concepts, legal methodologies, and historical narratives. Shia Islam places particular emphasis on the role of the Imams, spiritual and political leaders descended from Ali and Fatima, whom they believe were divinely appointed guides for the community. Sunni Islam emphasizes the collective scholarship of the community and the authority of consensus among learned scholars. The tragedy that would deepen this division occurred in 680 CE, 20 years after Ali's death. Muawiyah had died and his son Yazid had inherited the caliphate, despite the agreement that the succession should return to consultation. Many Muslims, including Hussein, the younger son of Ali and Fatima and the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid, whom they considered corrupt and unworthy of leading the Muslim community. Fact 50. Husayn ibn Ali, the Prophet's grandson, was killed along with most of his family and companions at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, an event that became central to Shia Islamic identity and is commemorated annually during the month of Muharram. The people of Kufa in Iraq had sent letters to Husayn, inviting him to come and lead them in opposition to Yazid's rule. Husayn, believing it was his duty to stand against what he saw as the corruption of Islamic leadership, set out from Medina toward Kufa with a small group of family members and supporters, including women and children. But the political situation in Kufa changed rapidly. The governor imprisoned or intimidated those who had invited Husayn, and when Husayn's caravan reached the plain of Karbala, near the Euphrates River, they found themselves confronted by an Umayyad army of thousands. For days, the small group was besieged, denied access to water even in the scorching heat of the desert. Husayn tried to negotiate, offering to return to Medina, to go to the frontiers of the empire, or to speak with Yazid directly, but all his offers were refused. Finally, on the 10th day of Muharram, the Umayyad forces attacked. Husayn and his male companions fought knowing they would die, and one by one they fell. Even Husayn's 6-month-old son was killed when an arrow struck him as Husayn held him, pleading for water for the infant. Finally, Husayn himself was killed and his body was mutilated. The survivors, primarily women and children, were taken captive and paraded through cities before being brought to Damascus. The tragedy of Karbala resonated throughout the Islamic world, not just among those who supported Ali's family, but among all Muslims who were horrified by the killing of the Prophet's grandson and the desecration of his body. For Shia Muslims, Karbala became the defining moment of their identity, a symbol of standing against tyranny and oppression even in the face of certain death. The commemoration of Ashura, the 10th day of Muharram, with its passion plays, processions, and mourning rituals, keeps the memory of Husayn's sacrifice alive in Shia communities to this day. Despite these painful divisions and political struggles, the Umayyad period from 661 to 750 CE also witnessed remarkable achievements. The Islamic Empire expanded further, reaching westward across North Africa and into Spain, and eastward into Central Asia and the borders of India and China. Fact 51. By the early 8th century, the Islamic Caliphate stretched from Spain in the west to the borders of India and China in the east, creating one of the largest empires in history and facilitating unprecedented cultural and intellectual exchange across 3 continents. This vast empire brought together diverse peoples, languages, and traditions under a common Islamic framework. The conquests, while certainly military undertakings, were not solely about territorial expansion. They created a connected world where ideas, technologies, and goods could travel along protected trade routes. Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian communities continued to practice their faiths while contributing to the administrative, intellectual, and economic life of the empire. Greek philosophy, Persian literature, Indian mathematics, and Chinese innovations would all eventually flow into Islamic civilization, where they would be translated, studied, developed, and later transmitted to medieval Europe. The Umayyads established Arabic as the administrative language of the empire, replacing Greek in the former Byzantine territories and Persian in the former Sasanian lands. This linguistic unification, combined with the centrality of Arabic to Islamic worship, helped create a shared cultural space across the vast empire. Yet the Umayyads also built upon the administrative traditions of the civilizations they had conquered, showing a pragmatic willingness to adapt useful systems and practices. Fact 52. the Umayyad Caliphate established Damascus as its capital and built the stunning Umayyad Mosque there, as well as the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which stands as one of the oldest surviving Islamic monuments and a masterpiece of early Islamic architecture. The Dome of the Rock, completed in 691 CE, was built on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the site from which Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven during the night journey. Its golden dome and intricate mosaics drew upon Byzantine artistic traditions while incorporating Islamic themes and Quranic verses. The building made a powerful statement about the new religion's permanence and sophistication, standing in visual dialogue with the Christian churches that dominated Jerusalem's skyline. The Quranic inscriptions on its walls emphasized Islamic theology, particularly the oneness of God and the human nature of Jesus, presenting Islam's theological positions in the heart of a city sacred to Judaism and Christianity. Yet, despite their architectural and administrative achievements, the Umayyads faced persistent criticism for their dynastic rule, their perceived departure from the simple piety of early Islam, and their discriminatory treatment of non-Arab Muslims called Mawali. As Islam spread beyond Arabia, many Persians, Berbers, and others converted to the faith, but under the Umayyads they were often treated as second-class Muslims, required to pay higher taxes and excluded from positions of power despite their conversion. Fact 53. The Abbasid revolution of 750 CE overthrew the Umayyad dynasty, with the Abbasids claiming to restore Islamic rule to its proper spiritual foundations and emphasizing equality among all Muslims regardless of ethnicity, though political realities often fell short of these ideals. The Abbasid movement began in the eastern provinces of the empire, particularly in Khorasan in modern-day Iran and Central Asia, where resentment against Umayyad rule was strongest among non-Arab Muslims. The Abbasids claimed descent from Abbas, an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, and they allied themselves with supporters of Ali's family, though they would later sideline these Shia allies after achieving power. Their revolution was brutal, with nearly the entire Umayyad family being hunted down and killed. Only one Umayyad prince, Abd al-Rahman, escaped the massacre and made his way to Spain, where he would establish an independent Umayyad emirate that would eventually become the Caliphate of Córdoba. The Abbasids moved the capital from Damascus to a new city they built in Iraq, Baghdad. Founded in 762 CE by the Caliph al-Mansur, Baghdad was strategically located on the Tigris River, close to the former Sasanian capital and at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting east and west. The city was designed as a circular city, the Round City, with the Caliph's palace and the main mosque at its center, symbolizing the centrality of political and religious authority. Fact 54. The Abbasid period, particularly the 8th through 10th centuries, is known as the Islamic Golden Age, a time of extraordinary achievements in science, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, literature, and the arts that helped preserve and advance human knowledge. Baghdad became the intellectual center of the world, attracting scholars from across the empire and beyond. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Mamun, established the House of Wisdom, a major intellectual center where scholars translated works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and other languages into Arabic. The works of Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, Euclid, and Galen were translated and studied, often with critical commentaries that advanced beyond the original texts. Muslim scholars made groundbreaking contributions across numerous fields. In mathematics, Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi developed algebra as a distinct mathematical discipline. Indeed, the word algebra comes from the Arabic al-Jabr in the title of his book. His works on algorithms, a word derived from his name, laid foundations for modern computing. In astronomy, Muslim scholars created precise astronomical tables, identified countless stars, and challenged and refined Ptolemaic models of the universe. In medicine, physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina wrote comprehensive medical encyclopedias that were used in European universities for centuries. Fact 55. The scientific method of hypothesis, experimentation, and verification was significantly developed by Muslim scholars like Ibn al-Haytham, who conducted experiments in optics and wrote about the importance of empirical evidence in the 11th century, centuries before this approach became common in Europe. Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as al-Hazan, conducted experiments with light, lenses, and vision that revolutionized the understanding of optics. He questioned the ancient Greek theories that vision resulted from rays emanating from the eyes, and through careful experimentation demonstrated that light travels from objects to the eyes. His work on reflection, refraction, and the nature of light laid groundwork for later European scientists like Roger Bacon and Johannes Kepler. His emphasis on experimentation and mathematical proof as the basis for scientific knowledge represented a methodology that would eventually transform how humanity understands the natural world. Islamic civilization preserved and transmitted much of the classical Greek knowledge that had been lost to Europe after the fall of Rome, and many Greek philosophical and scientific works only survived because they were translated into Arabic and later retranslated into Latin. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, much of the Greek intellectual heritage was lost to Western Europe. Libraries were destroyed, and knowledge of Greek became rare. But in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Islamic world, Greek texts continued to be studied and built upon. When Christian scholars in medieval Spain and Sicily encountered Arabic translations of Aristotle and other Greek philosophers, often with extensive commentaries by Muslim scholars like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, these works were translated into Latin and sparked the intellectual awakening that would eventually lead to the European Renaissance. The Islamic Golden Age was not merely a period of preserving ancient knowledge, but a time of remarkable innovation and creativity that touched every aspect of intellectual and cultural life. Muslim scholars approached learning with a spirit of curiosity and openness, believing that the pursuit of knowledge was itself an act of worship, a way of understanding God's creation. Fact 57. Islamic scholars developed sophisticated hospitals with specialized departments, medical schools, and pharmacies, with institutions like the Al-Mansuri Hospital in Cairo, treating thousands of patients daily regardless of their religion, gender, or ability to pay. These hospitals were marvels of medieval medicine, featuring separate wards for different diseases, including mental illness, which was treated with compassion rather than punishment. They had lecture halls where medical students learned from experienced physicians, libraries containing medical texts from various traditions, and gardens where medicinal herbs were cultivated. Some hospitals even had musical performances to aid in the healing of patients, recognizing the therapeutic value of music and pleasant environments. The concept of the hospital as a place of healing for all members of society, regardless of social status, was a revolutionary idea that Islamic civilization pioneered. Medical ethics developed significantly during this period as well. Muslim physicians followed codes of conduct that emphasized patient confidentiality, the obligation to treat all patients equally, and the importance of continuing education. The medical oath attributed to the physician Ishaq ibn Ali al-Ruhawi in the 9th century predates the modern Hippocratic Oath revisions and includes provisions about respecting patients' dignity and maintaining professional standards. While the Abbasid Caliphate presided over these intellectual achievements in Baghdad, the Islamic world was becoming increasingly diverse and fragmented politically. Independent dynasties emerged in various regions, though most still acknowledged the Abbasid Caliph as the symbolic spiritual leader of the Muslim world. Fact 58. The Fatimid Caliphate, established in North Africa in 909 CE and later centered in Cairo, was a Shia dynasty that rivaled the Sunni Abbasids and founded Al-Azhar, one of the oldest continuously operating universities in the world, which remains a major center of Islamic learning today. The Fatimids claimed descent from Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, and Ali, and they rejected the legitimacy of the Abbasid caliphs entirely, establishing their own competing caliphate. They built Cairo as their capital, constructing it adjacent to the older settlement of Fustat, and made it into a magnificent city. Al-Azhar, founded in 970 CE, began as a Shia institution, but after the fall of the Fatimid dynasty, it became a Sunni center of learning. For over 1,000 years, it has remained one of the most prestigious institutions for Islamic scholarship, training religious scholars, jurists, and theologians who have influenced Muslim communities worldwide. In the far west of the Islamic world, in the Iberian Peninsula known to Muslims as Al-Andalus, a unique civilization was flourishing. The Umayyad prince who had escaped the Abbasid massacre, Abd al-Rahman I, had established a dynasty in Spain that would preside over one of the most culturally sophisticated societies medieval Europe would witness. Fact 59. Islamic Spain, or Al-Andalus, particularly during the 10th and 11th centuries, became a center of religious tolerance, scientific advancement, and cultural achievement, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in relative harmony and collaborated in translating and producing works of philosophy, science, and literature. The city of Córdoba under the Umayyad Caliphate of Spain became one of the largest and most advanced cities in Europe, with paved streets, street lights, public baths, libraries, and a level of literacy that was exceptional for medieval times. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, with its famous horseshoe arches and intricate decorations, stood as a masterpiece of Islamic architecture. The city's library reportedly contained over 400,000 volumes at a time when the largest libraries in Christian Europe might have a few hundred books. In Al-Andalus, the concept of convivencia, or coexistence, allowed for a remarkable flowering of culture. Jewish philosophers like Moses Maimonides wrote in Arabic and engaged deeply with Islamic philosophy. Christian scholars studied Arabic to access the scientific and philosophical knowledge preserved and advanced in the Islamic world. Translation schools, particularly in Toledo after it came under Christian rule, became crucial bridges where Arabic texts were rendered into Latin, transmitting Islamic and ancient Greek knowledge to the rest of Europe. Yet this period of relative tolerance should not be romanticized beyond its historical reality. While Al-Andalus was more tolerant than most medieval societies, Christians and Jews still held subordinate legal status as dhimmis, or protected peoples, and periods of harmony alternated with times of persecution, particularly as the political situation deteriorated in later centuries. Nevertheless, the intellectual and cultural achievements of this time remain remarkable by any standard. Fact 60. The Crusades, beginning in 1096 CE, brought European Christian armies to the Middle East in attempts to capture Jerusalem and other holy sites, leading to centuries of conflict that deeply affected Christian-Muslim relations and left lasting impacts on both civilizations. Pope Urban II launched the First Crusade with the stated goal of aiding the Byzantine Empire against Muslim advances and recapturing Jerusalem for Christianity. For European knights and peasants, the Crusades offered adventure, spiritual merit through fighting for their faith, and potential material gain. The First Crusade succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, and the Crusaders established several Christian states in the Levant. The conquest of Jerusalem was accompanied by horrific violence, with the Crusaders massacring much of the city's Muslim and Jewish population. Muslim chronicles of the time described the streets running with blood and the systematic slaughter of men, women, and children who had taken refuge in mosques and synagogues. This traumatic event and the Crusader states that followed would shape Muslim perceptions of European Christianity for centuries to come. However, the Crusades also led to increased contact between Islamic and Christian civilizations. European crusaders encountered more advanced societies with sophisticated systems of medicine, architecture, agriculture, and governance. They brought back to Europe not only goods like sugar, spices, and silk, but also ideas and technologies. The experience of encountering Islamic civilization contributed to the eventual awakening of Europe from its medieval period. Fact 61. Salah al-Din, known in the West as Saladin, recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in 1187 CE and became renowned even among his enemies for his chivalry, mercy, and justice, sparing the city's inhabitants from the massacre that had accompanied its earlier Crusader conquest. Salah al-Din was a Kurdish military leader who rose to power in Egypt and then united Muslim territories in Syria and Egypt under his rule. His recapture of Jerusalem came after he defeated the Crusader armies at the Battle of Hattin. When he entered Jerusalem, he specifically ordered that there be no massacre or forced conversions. Christians were allowed to ransom themselves and leave the city safely, and those too poor to pay were freed without payment. Even Christian holy sites were protected, though the city's mosques, which had been converted to churches or stables, were restored to their original purpose. Salah al-Din's conduct earned him respect even from European chroniclers. He demonstrated that warfare could be conducted with honor and that victory did not require brutality. His example would be remembered by both Muslims and Christians as a model of how a leader should behave, even toward enemies. When he died in 1193, he had given away so much of his wealth in charity that there was barely enough money in his treasury to pay for his funeral. The Crusades continued for another century after Salah al-Din's death, but they ultimately failed to establish lasting Christian control over the Holy Land. The Muslim Mamluks, a dynasty of former slave soldiers who had seized power in Egypt, finally expelled the last Crusaders from the Levant in 1291. The Mamluks would go on to rule Egypt and Syria for over 2 centuries, and they would face a threat that terrified all the civilizations of the medieval world, the Mongols. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century devastated much of the Islamic world, with the sack of Baghdad in 1258 CE, ending the Abbasid Caliphate, destroying the House of Wisdom, and reportedly killing hundreds of thousands of the city's inhabitants, with the Tigris River said to have run black with ink from the books thrown into it. The Mongol conquests under Genghis Khan and his successors created the largest contiguous land empire in history, and they swept through Central Asia and the Middle East with unprecedented violence. Cities that resisted were often completely destroyed, their populations massacred as warnings to others. The fall of Baghdad was particularly catastrophic. The city that had been the intellectual and cultural center of the Islamic world for 500 years was reduced to ruins. Libraries accumulated over centuries were burned, irrigation systems were destroyed, and the last Abbasid caliph was executed. The psychological and cultural impact of the Mongol invasions cannot be overstated. For Muslims, the destruction of Baghdad and the Abbasid Caliphate seemed like the end of the world they had known. Yet Islam proved remarkably resilient. Within a few generations, many Mongols themselves converted to Islam, and Mongol rulers in Persia and Central Asia became patrons of Islamic culture and learning. The Ilkhanate in Persia, despite its violent origins, eventually produced some of the finest examples of Islamic art, architecture, and literature. Fact 63. The Ottoman Empire, founded by Turkish warriors in Anatolia around 1299 CE, would eventually become the most powerful and long-lasting of the later Islamic empires, lasting until 1922, and at its height controlling territories in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Ottomans began as one of several small Turkish principalities in Anatolia, but gradually expanded their territory through military prowess and effective administration. They captured Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire and transforming the great Christian city into Istanbul, which would become the Ottoman capital and one of the world's great cosmopolitan centers. The massive Hagia Sophia, for nearly 1,000 years the greatest church in Christendom, was converted into a mosque, though its Christian mosaics were preserved beneath plaster rather than destroyed. Fact 64. Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled from 1520 to 1566, presided over the Ottoman Empire at its height, overseeing military conquests, legal reforms, and architectural achievements, while his court became a center of arts, literature, and learning that rivaled any in Europe. Suleiman expanded Ottoman territory into Hungary and to the gates of Vienna, created a comprehensive legal code that earned him the title the lawgiver among his own people, and patronized the great architect Mimar Sinan, who built mosques, bridges, and public buildings throughout the empire. The Ottoman system brought a degree of order, stability, and religious tolerance to the diverse regions under its control. The millet system allowed religious communities, Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, Jews, and others, to govern their own internal affairs according to their own laws while paying taxes to the Ottoman state. The Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires, sometimes called the gunpowder empires because of their effective use of firearms and artillery, represented the Islamic world during the early modern period, from roughly the 15th to the 18th centuries. Each developed distinctive cultural traditions while sharing fundamental Islamic beliefs and practices. While the Ottoman Empire dominated the Western Islamic world, two other great empires rose to prominence in the East, each developing its own distinct interpretation of Islamic civilization and leaving lasting cultural legacies that endure to this day. Fact 65. The Safavid Empire, established in Persia in 1501 CE, made Twelver Shia Islam the official state religion, creating for the first time a major state explicitly founded on Shia principles and establishing the religious identity that would shape modern Iran. Shah Ismail I, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, claimed descent from the 7th Shia Imam and used this lineage to legitimize his rule. He made the previously diverse religious landscape of Persia uniformly Shia, sometimes through persuasion and sometimes through force. This decision created a distinct religious identity for Persia that differentiated it from its Sunni Ottoman neighbors to the west and Sunni Mughal neighbors to the east. The transformation was profound. Scholars were brought from Lebanon and other Shia centers to teach and establish religious institutions, and Persian culture became deeply intertwined with Shia religious expression. The Safavid capital of Isfahan became one of the most beautiful cities in the Islamic world. Shah Abbas I, who ruled from 1588 to 1629, transformed Isfahan with grand mosques, palaces, gardens, and bridges. The Naqsh-e-Jahan Square, one of the largest city squares in the world, was surrounded by architectural masterpieces, including the Shah Mosque with its stunning turquoise dome and intricate tile work. Persian miniature painting reached new heights of refinement. Carpets became increasingly sophisticated works of art, and poetry continued the traditions of great Persian poets like Rumi, Hafez, and Sadi. Fact 66. Jalal ad-Din Muhammad Rumi, a 13th century Persian poet and Sufi mystic, wrote poetry exploring divine love and spiritual union with God that has transcended religious and cultural boundaries, making him one of the most widely read poets in the world today. Rumi was born in present-day Afghanistan but spent most of his life in Konya, in modern-day Turkey. His mystical poetry, written primarily in Persian, uses images of love, longing, music, and dance to express the soul's journey toward union with the divine. His famous work, the Masnavi, a 6-volume spiritual poem, has been called the Quran in Persian for its profound exploration of spiritual themes. Rumi's poetry emphasizes love over rigid adherence to religious law, the unity of all existence in God, and the transformative power of divine love to elevate the human soul. Rumi's teachings gave rise to the Mevlevi order of Sufism, whose practitioners are known in the West as whirling dervishes for their practice of spinning meditation, a form of active remembrance of God through movement. This tradition continues today, demonstrating the enduring power of Rumi's spiritual vision. His poetry has been translated into dozens of languages, and in recent decades he has become one of the best-selling poets in the United States, appealing to readers of all backgrounds who find in his words a universal message of love and spiritual seeking. Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, developed various orders and practices throughout Islamic history, each emphasizing the inner, experiential aspect of faith alongside outward observance of Islamic law. Fact 67. Sufism emphasizes the inner spiritual dimensions of Islam through practices like dhikr, the remembrance of God through repetitive prayer or chanting, meditation, asceticism, and the guidance of spiritual teachers called sheikhs or pirs, seeking direct personal experience of the divine presence. Sufi orders spread throughout the Islamic world from North Africa to Southeast Asia, each developing distinct practices and teaching lineages. Some orders emphasized poverty and asceticism, others focused on poetry and music as paths to divine love, and still others developed elaborate metaphysical philosophies. Sufi shrines, built over the tombs of revered saints and teachers, became centers of pilgrimage and spiritual devotion, particularly in South Asia and North Africa, where they often served as focal points for the spread of Islam into new regions. Sufi missionaries were often more effective at spreading Islam than armies or merchants because they approached people with compassion, adapted to local cultures while maintaining Islamic principles, and demonstrated their faith through their character and spiritual states rather than through conquest. In regions like the Indian subcontinent and Indonesia, Islam spread primarily through the peaceful work of Sufi teachers who attracted followers through their wisdom, miracles attributed to them, and the universal appeal of their message of divine love. Fact 68. The Mughal Empire, founded in India in 1526 by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, created a sophisticated Islamic civilization in South Asia that at its peak ruled over most of the Indian subcontinent and included both Muslims and a large Hindu population. The Mughals faced a unique challenge: how to rule as a Muslim minority over a predominantly Hindu population. Different emperors approached this challenge differently. Akbar the Great, who ruled from 1556 to 1605, pursued a policy of religious tolerance and cultural synthesis. He abolished the jizya tax on non-Muslims, married Rajput Hindu princesses to forge political alliances, employed Hindus in high government positions, and even attempted to create a syncretic religion that would unite elements of Islam, Hinduism, and other faiths, though this last effort failed to gain acceptance. Akbar's court became a center of intellectual and artistic achievement, where scholars of different religions engaged in theological debates, where Persian and Indian artistic traditions merged to create the distinctive Mughal miniature painting style, and where architecture combined Islamic and Hindu elements. His grandson Shah Jahan would commission the most iconic monument of Mughal civilization, the Taj Mahal. Fact 69. The Taj Mahal, built by Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan between 1632 and 1653 as a mausoleum for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, stands as one of the world's most recognizable monuments and a masterpiece of Mughal architecture that combines Persian, Islamic, and Indian design elements. The Taj Mahal took over 20 years to complete and required the labor of thousands of artisans and craftsmen from across the empire and beyond. Its white marble surface is inlaid with semi-precious stones in intricate floral patterns. Its perfect proportions create a sense of ethereal beauty, and its 4 minarets frame the central dome in harmony. The monument is set in formal Persian gardens with reflecting pools that mirror its beauty, creating a vision of paradise on earth. The inscriptions around the entrance are verses from the Quran, including words welcoming the soul to paradise, transforming the tomb into a spiritual as well as architectural statement. The Taj Mahal represents not just architectural achievement, but the synthesis of cultures that characterize the best of Mughal civilization. Persian calligraphy, Turkish design principles, and Indian craftsmanship came together to create something entirely new. The Mughals patronized the arts lavishly, producing illustrated manuscripts, developing Urdu as a literary language that blended Persian and Hindi, and supporting music and dance traditions. However, the religious tolerance of Akbar was not maintained by all his successors. Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 to 1707, took a much more orthodox Islamic stance, reimposing the jizya tax, destroying some Hindu temples, and attempting to govern according to strict Islamic law. His policies created resentment among the Hindu population and contributed to rebellions that weakened the empire. After his death, the Mughal Empire gradually declined, fragmenting into smaller states and eventually falling under British colonial control. Fact 70. European colonial expansion from the 18th century onward gradually brought most Muslim-majority regions under European control. With the British Empire ruling over India and parts of Africa and the Middle East, the French controlling North Africa and parts of West Africa, and the Dutch ruling over present-day Indonesia. The colonial period was traumatic for Islamic civilization. Societies that had been politically independent and culturally confident found themselves subjugated by European powers that often viewed Islamic culture as backward and inferior. Colonial administrators disrupted traditional educational systems, imposed European languages and legal frameworks, and exploited the economic resources of colonized territories. Traditional Islamic scholarship declined as Western-style education was promoted or imposed, and Muslim intellectuals struggled with questions of how to respond to Western dominance, whether through resistance, reform, or synthesis. Yet colonialism also sparked Islamic reform movements as Muslims grappled with questions about why Muslim societies had fallen behind European powers technologically and militarily. Some reformers like Muhammad Abduh in Egypt and Syed Ahmad Khan in India argued for modernizing Islamic thought and education while maintaining essential Islamic values. They called for reinterpreting Islamic texts in light of modern conditions, embracing science and technology, and reforming social practices they considered un-Islamic innovations that had weakened Muslim societies. Fact 71. The Ottoman Empire, which had been gradually weakening since the 18th century, was finally dissolved after World War I, with the Caliphate being abolished in 1924 by the new Turkish Republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, ending an institution that had existed in some form for nearly 1,300 years. The end of the Ottoman Empire and the abolition of the Caliphate sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. For centuries, Muslims had looked to the Caliph as the symbolic leader of the global Muslim community, even if his actual political power had diminished. Ataturk's radical secularization of Turkey, banning religious clothing in public, replacing Islamic law with European law codes, changing the alphabet from Arabic script to Latin letters, and separating religion from state affairs, represented a dramatic break with Islamic tradition and sparked intense debates about Islam's role in modern society. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire also led to the reconfiguration of the Middle East by European powers. Britain and France drew borders, creating new states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, often without regard for ethnic, sectarian, or tribal realities on the ground. Palestine came under British mandate, and the seeds were planted for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that continues to this day. These arbitrary borders and the legacy of colonial rule would create political instability that has persisted for generations. Fact 72. The discovery and exploitation of oil in the Persian Gulf region during the 20th century transformed the economies and geopolitics of the Middle East, creating tremendous wealth for some Muslim-majority countries while also making the region strategically vital to global powers. Oil was discovered in Iran in 1908, in Iraq in 1927, in Bahrain in 1932, and in Saudi Arabia in 1938. After World War II, as the world economy became increasingly dependent on petroleum, the Gulf states became immensely wealthy and strategically important. This oil wealth allowed countries like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates to modernize their infrastructure rapidly, build impressive cities, and wield significant influence in global affairs. However, it also created economic imbalances, as countries with large populations but little oil like Egypt or Pakistan could not match this development, and it made the region a focus of great power competition and intervention. The 20th century brought profound transformations to the Islamic world as Muslim-majority nations navigated the challenges of independence, modernization, and defining their identities in a rapidly changing global landscape. The tensions between tradition and modernity, between local cultures and global forces, shaped the experiences of millions of Muslims worldwide. The creation of Pakistan in 1947 as a homeland for Muslims of the Indian subcontinent represented the first modern nation-state, explicitly founded on Islamic identity, emerging from the partition of British India that created both Pakistan and India as independent nations. The partition was one of the largest mass migrations in human history, with millions of Muslims moving to Pakistan and millions of Hindus and Sikhs moving to India. The violence that accompanied partition was horrific, with communal riots claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, envisioned a state where Muslims could live according to their values while protecting the rights of minorities. But the precise nature of Pakistan's Islamic identity has remained contested throughout its history. Questions about how Islamic law should relate to civil law, how to balance democracy with religious authority, and how to protect minority rights while maintaining an Islamic character have been ongoing debates in Pakistan and other Muslim-majority nations. The question of how Islam relates to governance and modern political systems became one of the central challenges facing Muslim societies in the 20th century. Different movements and thinkers proposed different answers, from complete secularization to the establishment of Islamic states governed entirely by religious law. Fact 74. The Muslim Brotherhood, founded in Egypt in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, became one of the most influential Islamic political movements of the 20th century, advocating for the implementation of Islamic law and the revival of Islamic values in society through education, social services, and political activism. The Muslim Brotherhood emerged in response to both British colonial rule and what its founders saw as the Western cultural invasion that was undermining Islamic values. It combined religious education with social welfare programs, establishing schools, hospitals, and charitable organizations that served the poor and built grassroots support. The Brotherhood's slogan, "Islam is the solution," reflected its belief that problems facing Muslim societies, political corruption, economic inequality, moral decay, could be addressed by returning to authentic Islamic principles. The movement spread beyond Egypt to other Arab countries and influenced Islamic political movements worldwide. Its approach was generally gradualist, seeking to Islamize society from the bottom up through education and social reform rather than through violent revolution, though some offshoots and later movements inspired by it would take more radical approaches. Governments in various Muslim-majority countries have alternated between tolerating, cooperating with, and suppressing the Muslim Brotherhood and similar movements, leading to cycles of political tension that continue today. In Iran, a different model of Islamic political authority emerged. After decades of rule by the increasingly autocratic and secular Shah, who had been supported by the United States and Britain, popular discontent erupted into revolution. Fact 75. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 overthrew the Shah and established an Islamic republic under the leadership of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, creating a unique form of government that combined democratic elements with clerical oversight based on Khomeini's concept of wilayat al-faqih, or guardianship of the jurist. Khomeini's theory held that in the absence of the hidden imam, Shia Muslims believed that the 12th imam went into occultation in 874 CE and will return as the Mahdi to establish justice. Religious scholars should provide guidance and oversight for society and government. The Iranian system that emerged included elected institutions like a parliament and president, but ultimate authority rested with the supreme leader, a high-ranking cleric, and a guardian council that could veto legislation deemed un-Islamic. The Iranian Revolution sent shockwaves through the Muslim world and beyond. For some Muslims, it demonstrated that Islamic governance was possible in the modern world and inspired Islamic political movements elsewhere. For others, particularly Sunni Muslims and secular Muslims, it represented a concerning fusion of religious and political authority that could lead to authoritarianism. The revolution also heightened sectarian tensions, as Sunni-majority countries, particularly Saudi Arabia, saw revolutionary Iran as a threat to their own stability and regional influence. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the subsequent decade-long war drew thousands of Muslim fighters from around the world to join the Afghan resistance, a conflict that would have profound and lasting consequences for global politics and the development of militant Islamist movements. The United States, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and other countries supported the Afghan Mujahideen resistance against the Soviet occupation, providing weapons, funding, and training. Many young Muslims from Arab countries, inspired by the idea of defending fellow Muslims against communist atheist invaders, traveled to Afghanistan to fight. Among them was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden, who used his resources to support the fighters and eventually established training camps. When the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, these foreign fighters, having tasted victory against a superpower, returned to their home countries or sought new causes. Some turned their focus to what they saw as corrupt governments in Muslim-majority countries, while others began viewing the United States and the West as enemies of Islam. The networks, training, and ideology developed during the Afghan war would eventually evolve into Al-Qaeda and other militant groups that would use terrorism in their pursuit of political and religious goals. Fact 77. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda against the United States killed nearly 3,000 people and triggered the War on Terror, leading to the U.S., invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and profoundly affecting Muslim communities worldwide who faced increased suspicion and discrimination despite the fact that the vast majority of Muslims condemned the attacks. The 9/11 attacks created a defining moment for Islam's relationship with the West in the 21st century. The hijackers claimed religious justification for their actions, though the overwhelming majority of Muslim scholars and organizations immediately condemned the attacks as completely contrary to Islamic teachings. Islamic principles clearly prohibit the killing of innocent civilians, and terrorism finds no legitimate basis in Islamic law. Yet the association between Islam and terrorism became fixed in many Western minds. Muslims around the world, particularly those living as minorities in Western countries, faced a backlash of suspicion, discrimination, and sometimes violence. Mosques were vandalized, Muslim women wearing hijab were harassed, and Muslim communities felt pressure to constantly apologize for and distance themselves from actions they had never supported. At the same time, Muslims engaged in intense internal debates about extremism, about how their religion was being interpreted and misused, and about how to counter violent ideologies while remaining true to their faith. The invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 further complicated the situation. While the Taliban regime in Afghanistan was widely considered oppressive even by many Muslims, the Iraq War was seen by much of the Muslim world as an unjustified invasion of a Muslim country based on false pretenses about weapons of mass destruction. The conflicts resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths, created millions of refugees, destabilized entire regions, and in the case of Iraq, inadvertently created conditions that would give rise to even more extreme groups like ISIS. Fact 78. Islam is currently the world's second largest religion, with approximately 1.9 billion followers, representing about 24% of the global population, and it is the fastest growing major religion, projected to nearly equal Christianity in size by 2050, according to demographic studies. Muslims constitute majorities in countries across North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, with the largest Muslim populations found in Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Significant Muslim communities also exist throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, and North America. The diversity of the Muslim world is remarkable. Muslims speak hundreds of languages, belong to numerous ethnic groups, follow different schools of Islamic law, and live under various political systems ranging from democracies to monarchies to authoritarian regimes. This diversity means that there is no single Muslim world or uniform Muslim perspective on most issues. An Indonesian Muslim may have very different cultural practices and political views from a Moroccan Muslim, an Iranian Muslim, or an American Muslim. Even while they share fundamental beliefs in the oneness of God, the prophethood of Muhammad, and the core practices of prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage. The global Muslim community, the Ummah, is united by shared beliefs and rituals, but diverse in its expressions of faith and engagement with modernity. Fact 79. The 5 pillars of Islam. The declaration of faith, the 5 daily prayers, giving to charity, fasting during Ramadan, and making the pilgrimage to Mecca, continue to unite Muslims worldwide and provide a common framework of practice across all the diversity of Islamic civilization. The Shahada, the declaration that there is no God but God and Muhammad is the messenger of God, is the foundational statement of Islamic faith, simple yet profound, affirming both monotheism and acceptance of Muhammad's prophetic mission. The 5 daily prayers, performed at prescribed times from before dawn to after sunset, create a rhythm of worship and remembrance throughout each day. Zakat, the obligatory charity, requires Muslims to give a portion of their wealth to those in need, institutionalizing care for the poor as a religious duty. Fasting during Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic lunar calendar, from dawn until sunset, teaches self-discipline, empathy for the hungry, and spiritual purification. The Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca brings together millions of Muslims from every corner of the world, dressed identically in simple white garments, performing the same ancient rituals, embodying the equality and unity of the Ummah. These practices, established in the 7th century, continue to shape the daily lives of Muslims in the 21st century. Whether in megacities or remote villages, whether in Muslim-majority countries or as minorities in predominantly non-Muslim societies, Muslims orient their lives around these pillars, creating a lived connection to their faith and to Muslims throughout history and across the world. Muslims believe in a day of judgment when all human beings will be resurrected and held accountable before God for their beliefs and actions, with paradise awaiting the righteous and hell awaiting those who rejected truth and committed evil, though God's mercy and forgiveness are emphasized as ultimately transcending His justice. This belief in ultimate accountability shapes Islamic ethics and morality. Every action, every word, every intention is recorded and will be evaluated. Yet the Quran emphasizes again and again that God is merciful, forgiving, and compassionate. God's mercy takes precedence over His wrath, and sincere repentance is always accepted. The purpose of human life from an Islamic perspective is to worship God, to live righteously, to care for others, and to prepare for the eternal life that awaits. This world is seen as a temporary testing ground where humans exercise their free will and demonstrate whether they will choose faith and goodness or rejection and evil. The Islamic conception of the afterlife is both spiritual and physical. Believers will experience paradise with their bodies and souls reunited, enjoying pleasures both physical and spiritual in gardens beneath which rivers flow, in the presence of God and free from all suffering. Hell is described as a place of intense suffering for those who rejected God's message and persisted in evil. Though some traditions hold that even hell may not be eternal for all its inhabitants, as God's mercy may eventually encompass even those who have been punished for their sins. These beliefs about judgment and the afterlife motivate Muslims to live consciously, to seek forgiveness for their shortcomings, and to strive toward righteousness in their daily lives. As we approach the end of our journey through Islamic history and beliefs, we find ourselves in the present moment, where 1.9 billion Muslims navigate the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. From the single revelation in a cave outside Mecca 14 centuries ago to a global community spanning every continent, Islam has endured through triumphs and tragedies, through golden ages and dark periods, through unity and division. And as the story continues to unfold, Muslims worldwide carry forward the message that began with that first word, Iqra, read, recite, seek knowledge, striving to live according to the teachings of their faith while engaging with a complex and rapidly changing world. As we continue our journey through the story of Islam, we turn to the lived experience of faith in the contemporary world, where Muslims navigate between preserving sacred traditions and engaging with modernity, between local cultures and global connections, between the timeless and the timely. The Quran emphasizes the concept of Tawheed, the absolute unity and uniqueness of God, teaching that God has no partners, no equals, no children, and no physical form, and that associating anything with God in worship, known as shirk, is considered the gravest sin in Islam. This radical monotheism distinguishes Islam's conception of God from many other religious traditions. God in Islam is utterly transcendent, beyond human comprehension, yet also intimately close to each person. The Quran states that God is closer to a person than their jugular vein, aware of every thought and every whispered word. God is described through 99 beautiful names in Islamic tradition: the merciful, the compassionate, the just, the wise, the provider, the forgiver. Each name revealing an aspect of the divine nature that humans can reflect upon. Muslims are taught that everything in creation points toward its creator. The order of the universe, the complexity of life, the human capacity for reason and moral awareness, all are seen as signs of God's existence and wisdom. Yet God remains fundamentally mysterious, beyond complete human understanding. The Quran states that nothing is like God, and Muslims avoid depicting God in any form, considering such attempts as diminishing the divine transcendence. This focus on God's absolute unity shapes Islamic theology, spirituality, and practice in profound ways. Fact 2. Islam recognizes all the biblical prophets, including Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, viewing them as messengers who brought God's guidance to their communities. And Muslims believe that Muhammad was the final prophet in this long chain, bringing a message intended for all humanity until the end of time. The Islamic narrative of history is essentially a story of prophecy. From Adam, the first human and first prophet, through Noah, who warned his people of impending destruction, through Abraham, who established monotheism, through Moses, who led the Israelites out of slavery and received the Torah, through Jesus, who performed miracles and preached compassion. All of these figures are revered in Islam as righteous messengers of God. Muslims believe that each prophet brought essentially the same core message: worship the one God, live righteously, and prepare for accountability in the afterlife. However, Muslims believe that previous scriptures were altered over time by human hands, either through deliberate changes or through errors in transmission. This is why God sent the final revelation through Muhammad, to preserve his message in its pure form for all subsequent generations. Muslims view the Quran as the culmination and correction of previous revelations, confirming what was true in earlier scriptures, while correcting what had been changed. This belief creates both connection and tension with Jewish and Christian traditions, as Muslims honor the same prophets while disagreeing about certain theological interpretations and historical claims. The concept of jihad in Islam literally means struggle or striving, and primarily refers to the inner spiritual struggle against one's ego and base desires, though it also includes the struggle to live righteously, to improve society, and in specific circumstances, to defend the Muslim community against aggression. The Prophet Muhammad reportedly said after returning from battle that the Muslims were returning from the lesser jihad of physical combat to the greater jihad of struggling against one's own spiritual failings. This prioritization of inner spiritual work over external conflict reflects the Quran's emphasis on purifying the heart, controlling anger and greed, being patient in difficulty, and constantly striving to become a better person. Most Muslims throughout history have understood jihad primarily in these spiritual and ethical terms. When jihad does refer to armed conflict, classical Islamic law established strict rules of engagement. Fighting is only permitted in self-defense or to stop oppression. Non-combatants must never be harmed. The environment must not be destroyed. Treaties must be honored, and even during war, Muslims must treat prisoners humanely and may not use disproportionate force. The distortion of jihad by extremist groups who use the term to justify terrorism represents a radical departure from mainstream Islamic understanding and has been condemned by the vast majority of Muslim scholars worldwide. Organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS invoke jihad to legitimize violence that violates fundamental Islamic principles, engaging in the very acts killing innocents, spreading chaos, forcing conversions that Islam explicitly prohibits. Fact 84. Islamic law, known as Sharia, is a comprehensive system derived from the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet's example, that covers not just legal matters, but ethics, worship, social interactions, and personal conduct, though its interpretation and application vary widely across different cultures and schools of thought. The word Sharia literally means the path to water, or the clear path, suggesting guidance towards sustenance and life. In its broadest sense, Sharia encompasses all of Islamic teachings: how to pray, how to conduct business honestly, how to treat one's parents and children, how to be just in legal disputes, and how to maintain spiritual awareness. Only a portion of Sharia deals with what Westerners would call law in the legal sense, such as criminal penalties, contracts, and family law. Over the centuries, Muslim scholars developed different schools of Islamic jurisprudence, known as madhabs, which sometimes reach different conclusions on specific legal questions while sharing fundamental principles. The four main Sunni schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, and the various Shia schools all recognize each other as legitimate interpretations of Islamic law, and Muslims are generally free to follow whichever school they prefer or to consult scholars from different schools on different issues. This diversity within Islamic legal tradition reflects the recognition that human interpretation of divine guidance can legitimately vary based on reasoning, context, and emphasis. In modern times, the relationship between Sharia and civil law has become contentious in many Muslim-majority countries. Some call for implementing Sharia as state law, while others argue for secular legal systems, and still others seek various forms of integration between Islamic principles and modern legal frameworks. The debate reflects deeper questions about religious authority, democracy, human rights, and cultural identity that Muslim societies continue to grapple with. Fact 85. Women's rights and roles in Islam have been subjects of intense debate both within Muslim communities and in global discourse, with the Quran granting women rights to property, inheritance, education, and consent in marriage that were revolutionary for 7th century Arabia, though interpretations of how these principles apply today vary widely. The Quran addressed women directly, granted them independent legal personalities, gave them the right to own and manage property without male guardianship, ensured them inheritance rights when women in most societies inherited nothing, required their consent for marriage, and allowed them to initiate divorce under certain conditions. The Prophet's wife Khadija was a successful businesswoman. His wife Isha became one of the greatest scholars of early Islam whose legal opinions shaped Islamic law, and Muslim women participated in public life, including accompanying armies as medics and even occasionally fighting in battle. However, the lived reality for Muslim women has varied enormously across time and place, often shaped more by cultural traditions than by Islamic teachings themselves. Practices like female genital mutilation, honor killings, and extreme restrictions on women's movement are cultural practices found in certain regions that have no basis in Islamic scripture and are condemned by many Muslim scholars. At the same time, certain Quranic verses about gender relations, inheritance ratios, and testimony have been interpreted in ways that many contemporary Muslims, particularly Muslim feminists, argue reflect patriarchal cultural assumptions rather than the egalitarian spirit of the Quran's message. Today, Muslim women occupy every role imaginable, from heads of state to scientists, from traditional homemakers to religious scholars, from athletes to entrepreneurs. Muslim-majority countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Indonesia have elected female prime ministers and presidents, while other Muslim-majority countries still restrict women's rights significantly. The diversity of Muslim women's experiences makes generalizations about women in Islam nearly impossible, though conversations about gender equality, women's education, and women's participation in religious interpretation continue to be vibrant areas of discussion within Muslim communities worldwide. Fact 86. The hijab, or headscarf, worn by many Muslim women is understood by those who wear it as an expression of modesty, dignity, and religious identity, though Muslim women themselves hold diverse views about whether it is religiously required, with some choosing to wear it and others choosing not to, and both positions finding support within Islamic scholarship. The Quran instructs both men and women to dress modestly and to lower their gaze, and it specifically tells women to cover their adornments except what normally appears, and to draw their coverings over their chests. The interpretation of exactly what this means, whether it requires covering the hair, what style of covering is acceptable, whether face covering is required or merely permitted, has been debated by scholars for centuries, with different conclusions reached in different times and places. For many Muslim women, wearing hijab is a personal choice that represents their faith commitment and their identity as Muslims. Some describe it as liberating, allowing them to be judged on their character and intellect rather than their appearance. Others view it as an act of worship, a daily reminder of their relationship with God. Still other Muslim women, equally devout, interpret the Quran's modesty requirements differently and do not cover their hair, or they view it as culturally specific to the Prophet's time rather than a universal requirement. The politics of hijab have become contentious in various contexts. In some Muslim-majority countries, women have been forced to cover their hair by law, denying them the choice that should be central to the practice. In some Western countries, Muslim women have faced discrimination or even legal restrictions on wearing religious coverings, being told they must uncover to participate in public life. Muslim women themselves often express frustration that outsiders, whether conservative religious authorities or secular governments, try to control their clothing choices rather than respecting their agency to make their own decisions about how to practice their faith and express their identity. Fact 87. Ramadan, the 9th month of the Islamic lunar calendar, is observed by Muslims worldwide through fasting from dawn until sunset, abstaining not only from food and drink but also from smoking and sexual relations, while increasing prayer, Quran recitation, and charitable giving, with the fast broken each evening in a meal called iftar. Ramadan commemorates the month when the Quran was first revealed to Muhammad, and fasting during this month is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, obligatory for all adult Muslims except those who are ill, traveling, pregnant, nursing, menstruating, or otherwise unable to fast safely. The fast is not merely physical but spiritual. Muslims are encouraged to avoid gossip, anger, and negativity, to practice patience and self-control, and to focus on spiritual growth and closeness to God. The experience of hunger and thirst throughout the day serves as a reminder of those who are less fortunate and cultivates empathy and compassion. Muslims often increase their charitable giving during Ramadan, and many mosques organize community iftars where people gather to break their fast together, strengthening social bonds and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their economic situation, has food to break their fast. The pre-dawn meal before the fast begins, called suhoor, and the evening iftar become times for family gathering and community connection. Ramadan culminates in Eid al-Fitr, one of the 2 major Islamic holidays, a day of celebration that begins with communal prayer and continues with feasting, gift-giving, and visiting family and friends. The spiritual discipline of the month gives way to joy and gratitude as Muslims celebrate having completed the fast and hope that their worship has been accepted by God. In Muslim-majority countries, the entire society adjusts its rhythm during Ramadan, with altered work hours, special television programming, and streets coming alive after sunset, with people socializing and celebrating. Fact 88. The other major Islamic holiday, Eid al-Adha, or the Festival of Sacrifice, commemorates Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son in obedience to God, with Muslims traditionally sacrificing an animal such as a sheep, goat, or cow, and distributing the meat among family, friends, and especially the poor, emphasizing themes of sacrifice, obedience to God, and caring for those in need. The story of Abraham's test appears in both the Quran and the Bible, though Islamic tradition generally identifies the son Abraham was commanded to sacrifice as Ishmael rather than Isaac. The essence of the story remains the same. Abraham's faith was so complete that when God commanded him to sacrifice his beloved son, he prepared to obey, and both father and son submitted to God's will. At the last moment, God provided a ram to sacrifice instead, having proven Abraham's devotion. Muslims performing the Hajj pilgrimage sacrifice animals on Eid al-Adha as part of their pilgrimage rituals, and Muslims around the world who are not on pilgrimage also make sacrifices if they are financially able. The meat is typically divided into 3 parts: 1/3 for the family, 1/3 for friends and relatives, and 1/3 for the poor. This distribution ensures that everyone, regardless of economic status, can participate in the celebration and enjoy meat, which may be a rare luxury for some families. The holiday lasts for 3 to 4 days and, like Al-Fitr, is marked by communal prayers, family gatherings, gift-giving to children, and visiting with extended family and friends. Both Eids provide Muslims with times of joy and celebration, breaking up the year and creating shared communal experiences that bind the Ummah together across all its diversity. As we approach the end of our journey through the story of Islam, we reflect on how this faith continues to shape lives, inspire devotion, and evolve in the contemporary world, remaining both anchored in ancient revelation and responsive to modern challenges. Islamic art and architecture developed distinctive characteristics including intricate geometric patterns, flowing calligraphy, and arabesque floral designs, often avoiding figurative representation of humans and animals in religious contexts out of concern that such images might lead to idolatry, instead creating abstract beauty that points toward the infinite. The great mosques of the Islamic world, from the Blue Mosque in Istanbul with its cascading domes and slender minarets, to the Alhambra Palace in Granada with its delicate stucco work and reflecting pools, to the modern Hassan II Mosque in Casablanca with its laser beam pointing toward Mecca, demonstrate the extraordinary creativity that flourished within Islamic aesthetic principles. Geometric patterns based on mathematical principles suggest the underlying order of God's creation, while calligraphy transforms the words of the Quran into visual art, making the divine message beautiful to the eye as well as to the ear. Islamic calligraphy developed into a highly refined art form with different scripts used for different purposes. The angular Kufic script for monumental inscriptions, the flowing Naskh for copying the Quran, the elaborate Thuluth for decorative purposes. Master calligraphers spent years perfecting their craft, understanding that they were not merely writing words, but creating visual expressions of divine revelation. The written word in Islam carries special significance because it preserves and transmits God's message, and beautifying that word became an act of devotion. The prohibition on representational art in religious contexts led to extraordinary innovation in abstract design. Artisans developed complex geometric patterns that could theoretically extend infinitely in all directions, suggesting the infinite nature of God. Arabesques, flowing plant-based designs that never quite repeat exactly, created a sense of organic growth and natural beauty. These aesthetic principles extended beyond religious buildings to everyday objects. Carpets, pottery, metalwork, textiles, and manuscript illuminations all displayed the characteristic Islamic attention to pattern, proportion, and the integration of text and design. The call to prayer, or adhan, is recited 5 times daily from mosques around the world, with the muezzin calling the faithful to prayer in melodious Arabic phrases that declare God's greatness, testify to Muhammad's prophethood, and invite believers to come to success through prayer. The adhan begins with Allahu Akbar, God is greatest, repeated 4 times, followed by the declaration of faith. I bear witness that there is no God but God. I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Then comes the invitation, come to prayer, come to success. And for the dawn prayer, the additional phrase, prayer is better than sleep. The call concludes again with declarations of God's greatness and the oneness of God. These phrases, chanted in a melodious voice that varies by region and tradition, have marked the passage of time in Muslim communities for 14 centuries. In the past, the muezzin would climb to the top of the minaret and call out in his natural voice, his call reaching as far as his lungs and the acoustics of the city would allow. Today, loudspeakers amplify the call, and in cities with large Muslim populations, multiple adhans from different mosques may overlap, creating a layered soundscape that announces the prayer time. For Muslims, the adhan is a beloved sound, a reminder to pause from worldly activities and turn their attention to God, a call that transcends the noise and distraction of daily life. Muslims believe in angels as beings created from light who serve God and carry out his commands, including Gabriel, who delivered revelations to the prophets, Michael, who provides sustenance to humans, Israfil, who will blow the trumpet announcing the day of judgment, and the angel of death, who takes souls at the appointed time. Angels in Islamic theology are neither male nor female. They have no free will and cannot disobey God, and they carry out specific functions in the divine plan. 2 angels accompany each person throughout life, one on the right shoulder recording good deeds, and one on the left recording sins, creating the record that will be presented on the day of judgment. Angels pray for believers and ask God's forgiveness for them, and they were present at the Battle of Badr, supporting the Muslims in their struggle. Jinn, on the other hand, are beings created from smokeless fire who, unlike angels, possess free will and can choose between good and evil. Some jinn are righteous believers, while others, including Iblis or Satan, rebelled against God. The Quran describes how God created Adam from clay and commanded the angels and jinn to bow to him in respect, but Iblis refused out of pride, saying he was created from fire and was therefore superior to clay. For this arrogance and disobedience, he was expelled from paradise, but given respite until the day of judgment to lead humans astray. Islamic theology views Iblis not as an equal opposite to God, but as a created being whose rebellion and temptation of humans are ultimately part of the divine test of human free will. Fact 92. The concept of Ummah, the global community of Muslims, emphasizes the unity and brotherhood of all believers regardless of race, nationality, language, or social status, with the ideal that Muslims should support one another and work together for the common good, though the reality has often fallen short of this ideal. The Prophet Muhammad stated in his farewell sermon that all Muslims are brothers and sisters, and that an Arab is not superior to a non-Arab, nor is a white person superior to a black person except in righteousness. This declaration of human equality was revolutionary in a society structured by tribal hierarchies and ethnic divisions. Throughout Islamic history, the Ummah has served as a powerful ideal that could transcend local identities and create bonds across vast distances. A Muslim traveler in medieval times could find hospitality in a mosque or with fellow Muslims anywhere from Spain to China, welcomed as part of the global community of faith. Yet the Ummah has also experienced deep divisions: the Sunni-Shia split, ethnic and national conflicts, theological disputes, and political rivalries. Muslim-majority countries have fought wars against each other. Sectarian violence has claimed countless lives, and the unity envisioned by Islamic teachings has often been elusive. Contemporary movements and organizations continue to emphasize the importance of Muslim unity, while Muslims navigate the tensions between this universal religious identity and their particular national, ethnic, cultural, and political identities. Islamic finance developed principles prohibiting riba, or usury and interest, requiring that financial transactions be based on the sharing of risk and reward rather than guaranteed returns, and excluding investments in businesses involving alcohol, gambling, pork, or other prohibited activities, leading to the development of alternative financial instruments like profit-sharing partnerships and leasing arrangements. The prohibition of riba is rooted in the Quran, which strongly condemns those who engage in usurious practices. Islamic scholars interpret this prohibition to mean that money should not generate money by itself. There must be an underlying productive activity or asset. This principle led to the development of creative financial structures where banks and customers share in the profits and losses of business ventures rather than the bank simply lending money at interest. Sukuk, Islamic bonds where investors own a share of an asset rather than receiving interest on a loan, have become a multi-billion-dollar market. Critics argue that some Islamic financial products are merely conventional financial instruments with different terminology, achieving essentially the same results as interest-bearing loans, but with more complexity. Defenders maintain that even if some products walk a fine line, the underlying principles encourage more ethical and socially responsible finance by connecting money to real productive activities and by excluding harmful industries. The development of Islamic finance has created a niche in the global financial system, with Islamic banks, investment funds, and insurance companies operating in many countries and serving both Muslim customers who want their finances to align with their faith and non-Muslim customers attracted to ethical investment principles. Fact 94. The Quran emphasizes education and the pursuit of knowledge, with the Prophet Muhammad stating that seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim, male and female, and that one should seek knowledge even if it requires traveling as far as China, contributing to Islam's historical emphasis on scholarship and learning. This religious sanction for education motivated the creation of institutions of learning throughout the Islamic world. The madrasa system, which began in the 9th century and flourished from the 11th century onward, provided free education to students, covering not just religious subjects, but mathematics, astronomy, medicine, logic, and philosophy. Major madrasas like Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco, founded in 859 CE, and Al-Azhar in Egypt, are among the oldest degree-granting universities in the world and continue to operate today. Islamic civilization prized scholars highly, often elevating them to positions of influence and respect in society. The Hadith collections, books of Islamic jurisprudence, scientific treatises, and philosophical works that Muslim scholars produced represent an extraordinary intellectual heritage. In contemporary times, Muslim-majority countries show varying levels of educational development, with some investing heavily in modern education and achieving high literacy rates and scientific output, while others struggle with underfunded schools and limited access to quality education, particularly for girls in some regions. The question of how to balance religious education with modern scientific and technical education remains a topic of discussion in many Muslim communities. Some advocate for integrated approaches that combine Islamic values and knowledge with modern subjects, while others maintain separate systems of religious and secular education. Many Muslims work to demonstrate that Islam and science are compatible, pointing to the Quran's encouragement of reflection on natural phenomena and to Islamic civilization's historical contributions to science as evidence that faith and reason can work in harmony. Fact 95. Muslims believe in divine predestination, qadar, holding that God has knowledge of all that will occur and has written the destiny of all creation. Yet this belief coexists with the concept of human free will and moral responsibility, creating a theological tension that Muslim scholars have explored for centuries without reaching unanimous conclusions. The Quran affirms both that nothing happens without God's will and that humans have genuine choices for which they are accountable. How these truths fit together has been debated extensively. Some scholars emphasize divine predetermination, arguing that human sense of choice is illusory and everything is predetermined by God. Others emphasized human free will and responsibility, arguing that God's knowledge of future events does not cause them, just as knowing that the sun will rise tomorrow does not cause it to rise. Most mainstream Islamic theology settled on a middle position. God has complete knowledge and ultimate control, but humans have genuine agency within the boundaries God has established, and they will be judged for the choices they make with that agency. This paradox, that God is all-powerful and all-knowing, yet humans are genuinely free and responsible, is accepted as a mystery, with many Muslims finding comfort in trusting that God's wisdom transcends human understanding while taking seriously their own moral choices and their consequences. Fact 96. The Islamic greeting, Assalamu alaikum, meaning peace be upon you, with its response, Wa alaikumu assalam, and upon you be peace, reflects Islam's emphasis on peace, harmony, and goodwill, with the word Islam itself sharing a root with the Arabic word for peace, salam. This greeting is recommended for Muslims to exchange whenever they meet, creating countless daily affirmations of peace and well-wishing. The Prophet taught that spreading the greeting of peace was one of the best practices in Islam, encouraging Muslims to greet even strangers and to respond to greetings with equal or better words. This simple practice reinforces social bonds, reminds people of shared values, and creates an atmosphere of mutual respect and care. The connection between Islam and peace extends beyond linguistic roots. Islamic teachings emphasize peacemaking, reconciliation, and the preservation of harmony. The Quran describes believers as those who enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong, calling Muslims to be agents of justice and goodness in their communities. While Islam permits defensive warfare under specific conditions, it also teaches that if an enemy inclines toward peace, Muslims should accept it, and that forgiveness and patience are preferable to retaliation when possible. The ideal Muslim society in Islamic thought is one characterized by justice, compassion, mutual support, and peace, values that countless Muslims strive to embody in their personal lives and communities, even when surrounding circumstances are difficult.